Hey there and welcome back. If the day has finally let go of you, and the house has gone quiet around you, and you are ready to be lifted out of your own ordinary evening and set down in a stranger, older one, then settle in and make yourself comfortable, because tonight I want to take you into an age where the dark was full of meaning. Tonight we are going back nearly 500 years into the England of the Tudors, into a country lit by candle and hearth, where every shadow in the corner of a room might be something more than shadow, and where the line between prayer and spell, between medicine and magic, between a wise woman and a witch, was so fine that a person could step across it without ever knowing they had moved. It is an age we think we understand, the world of Henry VIII and his daughters, of ruffs and great houses and beheaded queens. But underneath the politics and the pageantry there ran a deeper current, a whole hidden way of seeing, in which the sky sent warnings, the body carried secret marks, and a soured pot of milk could set a village whispering the name of a neighbour. And at the very centre of that world, for a while, there stood a queen. She wore the crown of England. She was the most watched woman in the land, and long after she was gone, her enemies would take her memory and reshape it into something monstrous, giving her a sixth finger, a mark upon her throat, and the whispered reputation of a woman who had bewitched a king. Her name was Anne Boleyn, and by the time this long night is over, you will understand exactly how a real woman, a clever and frightened and entirely human woman, could be turned by nothing more than rumour and fear into a creature of the dark. That is what draws me to this world, and what I think will hold you as the evening softens around you, the strange truth that the Tudor mind was not a stupid one, only a frightened one, reaching for shapes to put upon the night. If these long journeys into other centuries are something you find you would like to take again, you are always welcome to subscribe and to keep me company the next time we open a door into the past and step quietly through it together. There is no hurry about any of it tonight. The hours ahead are simply hours to wander through, from the candlelit chamber of a queen to the smoky cottage of a village wife, from the astrologer bent over his charts to the frightened family scratching marks above their door, and you are welcome to let it all grow slowly dim and distant in your mind until it carries you gently down into sleep. Picture this. It is a night in the deep countryside of England, in the reign of the Tudors, and the darkness is one we have almost entirely forgotten. There are no street lamps anywhere in the world. There is no glow on the horizon from a distant town, no soft electric hum, no light at all beyond the moon and the stars, and whatever small flame a household can afford to keep burning. When the sun goes down over a Tudor village, it takes the whole visible landscape with it. The fields vanish, the lane vanishes. The church tower that stood so plainly against the afternoon sky dissolves into the black, and the only light left is the low red eye of the fire on the hearth, and perhaps a single rushlight, a length of dried reed soaked in fat, giving off a small wavering flame and a thin thread of smoke. Beyond the walls of the cottage the night presses in, enormous and complete, and inside it the family gathers close to the fire, because the fire is warmth, and the fire is light, and the fire, they believe, is something more than either. Come closer, into that ring of firelight, and let us understand what these people saw when they looked out into the dark, because to understand that is to understand everything that follows. To live in Tudor England was to live in a place that was crowded in a way ours is not. We think of the past as emptier than the present, fewer people, fewer buildings, fewer voices, and in the daylight sense that is true. But the Tudor world was thronged with invisible presences, packed with unseen powers, and a person moving through it was never truly alone. Above them, ordering everything, was God, and around God the whole shining machinery of heaven, the angels ranked in their choirs. But below that bright order, and pressing much closer to the ground, there was another population entirely. There were the spirits of the dead, who might not be as safely gone as one hoped. There were the fairies, who were nothing like the small winged creatures of a child's picture book, but capricious and dangerous beings who lived just out of sight and took a keen and often cruel interest in the affairs of men. There was the devil himself, real and active and endlessly busy, walking the lanes of England looking for souls to snare. And there were his servants, the witches, who might be anyone at all, the old woman at the end of the row, the midwife, the herb wife, the beggar you turned away from your door that morning with a curse still hanging in the air behind her. For the ordinary Tudor man or woman, none of this was superstition in the way we would use the word, a set of silly beliefs held instead of the truth. It was simply the truth, the plain furniture of reality, as certain as the harvest and the seasons and the king upon his throne. The educated believed it, and the illiterate believed it. The bishop in his palace and the ploughman in his furrow shared, at bottom, the same map of the universe, an universe layered from the highest heaven to the lowest pit, with a world of men strung precariously in the middle, exposed on every side to influences pouring down from the stars and up from the earth, and in from the invisible countries that lay alongside the visible one. The great questions of a life, whether the baby would live, whether the crops would come, whether the fever would break, whether the marriage would be happy, were understood to be decided not only by chance or by God, but by this whole thronging world of powers, some of which could be prayed to, some of which could be bargained with, and some of which had to be fought off, night after night, with every charm and mark and ritual a frightened people could devise. And so the dark was not empty. That is the thing to hold on to as we begin. When the Tudor family banked its fire and climbed the ladder to the loft to sleep, the blackness they lay down in was not the neutral, meaningless void of a modern bedroom. It was a living dark, a crowded night, a blackness through which things moved. The wind in the thatch might be the wind, or it might not. The creak on the stair might be the timbers settling in the cold, or it might be something that had slipped in past the protective marks, scratched above the threshold. The Tudor night was thick with possibility, and most of the possibilities were frightening, and the people who lay awake listening to it were not fools. They were simply doing what human beings have always done, which is to look into the night and try, with everything they have, to make sense of what might be looking back. Over the course of this long evening, we are going to walk through the whole of that hidden world, and we are going to begin where the fear pressed hardest and climbed highest, right at the top, in the perfumed and candlelit chambers of the court, with the woman who wore the crown. But before we climb to the court, stay a moment longer in the blackness of the countryside, and let it settle fully around you, because the quality of that darkness is the thing our own age has most completely lost, and everything else grows out of it. Think of how the night sounded, in a world with no engines and no distant hum of anything, a silence so deep that a single dog barking half a mile off carried clear across the fields, that the wind in the trees was the loudest thing for miles, that a footstep on the lane at midnight was an event to lie awake and wonder at. Think of how it smelled, of wood smoke and tallow and damp earth and the animals that often shared the lower room of the house, of the rushes on the floor, and the herbs hung to dry in the roof. Think of how cold it was, a cold that the small fire barely held at bay, so that the family drew close together for warmth as much as for company, and the bed was piled high, and the very young and the very old were set nearest the embers. And think above all of how little light there was, and what that did to the mind. A single flame throws long shadows, and shadows move when the flame moves, and a room lit by one rushlight is a room full of shifting darknesses at its edges, of shapes half seen and corners never quite lit, of a door to the next room that is simply a rectangle of black. The human eye straining in such a light makes patterns out of very little, and the human imagination in such a place fills the unlit spaces with whatever it most fears or hopes. Our ancestors were not more foolish than we are, but they lived a third of their lives in a blackness we only ever glimpse, and in that gloom the boundary between the seen and the imagined grew thin, and the mind reached out into the black, and met sometimes the shapes of its own deepest fears, and could not always tell them from something real. Hold that darkness in your thoughts as we go on. The true, thick, living blackness of the Tudor night, because it is the ground on which everything else that we will see tonight was built. Let us go, then, to Anne Boleyn, because her story holds the whole of this world inside it in miniature. She was not, by any honest reckoning, a witch, and she was never once accused of witchcraft in any court of law. When she was brought down, in the spring of 1536, and tried, and condemned, and executed within the walls of the Tower of London, the charges laid against her were treason, adultery, and incest, terrible and almost certainly false, but entirely of this world. Not one word of sorcery appeared in her indictment, and yet, if you were to ask people today what they half remember about Anne Boleyn, a surprising number would tell you that she had 6 fingers, that she had a great mole or wen upon her neck, and that she had used dark arts to snare the king and steal him from his lawful wife. None of it is true. All of it has clung to her name for centuries, and the story of how it came to cling there is the perfect doorway into the Tudor imagination, because it shows us, with unusual clarity, exactly how a living woman gets turned into a monster. Anne was a striking woman rather than a conventionally beautiful one, dark of eye and hair at a time when the fashion ran to fair, quick-witted, French-polished, elegant, with a sharp tongue and a talent for holding a room. She had spent her girlhood at the most sophisticated courts in Europe, and she came home to England glittering with a foreign glamour that both attracted and unsettled the people around her. When the king fell in love with her, and the whole known order of the world was torn apart so that he could have her, when a marriage was broken, and a church was broken, and a country was set on a new and frightening road, all for the sake of this one striking, clever, ambitious woman, it is not hard to see how the ordinary people of England, who loved the old queen and hated the upstart who had replaced her, began to reach for an explanation. How could such a thing happen? How could a king throw over a princess of Spain, defy the Pope, and remake the whole religious life of his kingdom for a woman most of them considered no better than she should be? That there had to be more to it. There had to be some hidden power at work, and the readiest explanation, the one that lay closest to hand in the Tudor mind, was that she had bewitched him. There was even a scrap of royal words to feed the whisper. In the last frightened months of the marriage, the king himself was reported by a foreign ambassador to have said that he had been seduced into the union by sortilege, a slippery old word that could mean a charm, a spell, an enchantment. It was almost certainly the self-pitying grumble of a man looking for a way to escape a marriage that no longer suited him, a way to say none of this was my fault. I was not myself. I was under a spell. The ambassador who reported it did not speak good English, and was passing on something he had heard at third or fourth hand, and it may have meant very little. But you can see how a word like that, once loose in the air, would travel. The king says he was bewitched. The king says he was under a spell, and the woman at the centre of it, already resented, already foreign, already strange, becomes in the retelling not a rival to be pitied, but a sorceress to be feared. This is how it begins, always, not with evidence but with a need, the need to explain a frightening event by giving it a human face and a human cause, and then to make that face as dark and as guilty as the fear requires. And a royal court, for all its silk and its gold, was one of the most fear-haunted places in the whole kingdom, a hothouse in which rumour grew faster, and rotted quicker than anywhere else in the land. Everything at court was watched. Every glance the king gave, each favour shown or withdrawn, each rise and each fall, was studied by hundreds of anxious eyes, for on the king's pleasure hung every fortune in the room. In such a place a queen who had lost the king's love was not merely unhappy, she was in mortal danger, and everyone around her knew it, and drew away from her, and began, quietly, to prepare for the world that would come after her. The atmosphere of Anne's last months can only have been one of gathering dread, a slow chill spreading through the chambers that had once been the warmest and most brilliant in England, as the woman at the centre of them felt the warmth withdrawing and could not stop it, and watched the faces around her change, and understood, with a rising terror, she could show to no one, where it was all leading. Into an atmosphere like that, a whisper of witchcraft falls like a spark into dry straw. When the powerful are afraid, and looking for a reason to destroy someone, and half hoping to find one, the darkest explanation is always the most welcome, because it is the most complete. To say that the Queen had merely fallen out of favour is to admit the ugly ordinary truth of court politics, in which anyone might be next. But to say that she had bewitched the king, that dark powers had been at work, that she was not a wronged woman but a dangerous and unnatural thing, is to make her destruction not a crime but a cleansing, not a tragedy but a deliverance. The charge of witchcraft, or even the mere unspoken shadow of it hanging in the air, does a particular kind of work. It turns the victim into the threat. It lets the frightened and the guilty tell themselves that in destroying her they are not doing wrong but casting out an evil, and there are few things in all of human history more dangerous than frightened people who have persuaded themselves that their cruelty is a kind of virtue. We will come back to Anne again and again all through this evening, and we will return to her properly at the very end when we can see her whole. But for now, hold on to this. The most famous witch in Tudor memory was not a witch at all. She was a woman that frightened people needed to believe in. And to understand how that need worked, we have to look next at the marks they thought they could read upon her body. The Tudor world believed, deeply and almost universally, that guilt could be written on the flesh. This is one of the strangest ideas to recover from that lost mental universe, and one of the most important, because so much of the machinery of witch fear ran on it. The belief was this: when a person made a pact with the devil, sold their soul and took him as their master, the bargain was sealed upon the body. The devil set his mark upon his new servant, somewhere on the skin, a sign of ownership as a farmer might brand a beast, and this mark, once you knew to look for it, could be found. It might be a patch of skin that felt nothing when pricked with a pin. It might be a mole, a wart, a birthmark, a skin tag, a scar. It might be a small raised piece of flesh which, the belief went, was a teat, a place from which the witch suckled the small demon servants, the familiars, who did her bidding in the shapes of cats and toads and mice. A body, in other words, could be searched, and searched it was, and any oddity found upon it could be read as the signature of hell, and behind every one of these marks and pacts and searches stood a single towering figure, the devil himself, who was to the Tudor mind not a metaphor and not a distant abstraction, but a real and present power, active in the world, every hour of every day. We have largely lost the sheer vivid immediacy of him. To the people of that age, Satan was as real as the king, and a great deal nearer, forever prowling the world in search of souls to win, appearing to the desperate and the tempted, offering his bargains, setting his snares. He might come as a dark gentleman met upon a lonely road, courteous and persuasive, offering money or revenge or the ending of a hunger in exchange for a soul and a signature in a dreadful book. He might come as a whisper in the ear of the resentful, turning a grievance into a curse. He might come, it was believed, to the poor and the outcast above all, to the woman who had nothing, and offer her the one thing she lacked, power, the power to strike back at those who had scorned her, in exchange for the ruin of her soul. This was the imagined bargain at the root of the whole terror, the pact with the devil, and the mark upon the body was its seal. To picture him, the age reached for images of horror and of mockery both. He was given horns and a tail, and cloven hoofs, the shape half man and half beast that mocked the divine order of creation. He was given the power to appear in any form, as a beast, as a handsome stranger, as a black dog, as one of the small familiar creatures that did a witch's bidding. He was cold, it was said, cold to the touch, for he was dead to grace and to warmth, and he was everywhere, and tireless, and clever beyond any human cleverness, so that the ordinary Christian soul was understood to be walking, every day of its life, through a world in which this vast malignant intelligence was constantly at work, probing for weakness, offering temptation, and waiting, with endless patience, for the one unguarded moment. It is hard now to feel how heavy that presence lay upon the mind. But without it, none of the rest makes sense. None of the marks or the bottles or the trials, for they were all, in the end, the defences of a frightened people against a devil they believed to be as real as the ground beneath their feet, and a great deal more dangerous. Now think what that meant for a woman like Anne Boleyn, and for thousands of humbler women after her. Every human body carries marks. Moles, freckles, birthmarks, the small blemishes and irregularities of ordinary flesh. We all have them, and in a world that read them as evidence, that they became terribly dangerous things to carry. It did not matter whether Anne actually had a mole upon her neck. What mattered was that once the story of her witchcraft was in the air, the human imagination went to work and gave her the marks the story required. If she was a witch, she must bear the witch's signs, and so, in the retelling, she grew them. A small blemish becomes a great wen. An ordinary hand becomes a hand with an extra finger. The body is remade in memory and rumour to match the crime. And the man who did more than any other to fix these false marks upon her forever was not even her contemporary. He was writing nearly 50 years after her death, and it had a reason to want her monstrous. The belief that the body could be read did not stop at the devil's mark, for the whole of a person's face and form was thought to be a kind of writing, in which a skilled eye could discern the soul within. This was the art of physiognomy, the reading of character in the features, and it was taken seriously by learned and unlearned alike. A high forehead, a certain set of the eyes, the shape of a nose or a chin or a mouth, the colour of the hair, all were held to reveal the inward nature, so that a man might be judged honest or treacherous, bold or cowardly, lustful or temperate, by the cast of his face alone. Red hair was looked at askance, associated with a hot and untrustworthy temper, and with betrayal. Beauty was thought hopefully to be the outward sign of virtue, and ugliness the sign of a crooked soul, though everyone knew, and the moralists never tired of warning, that a fair face might hide a foul heart, and that devil himself could come clothed in beauty. And the hand, too, was studied, its lines and mounts pored over for the story they were thought to tell, the length of life, the fortunes of love, the coming of wealth or ruin, in the art of palmistry that the cunning folk and the wandering fortune-tellers practised at fair and market. To have your palm read, your face studied, your fortune told, was one of the small excitements of a fair day, half believed and half in fun, and yet resting on the same deep conviction that ran through the whole age, that the outward and visible was everywhere the sign and mirror of the hidden and inward, that nothing was merely itself, that the body was a text and the face was a book, and the lines of the hand were a map of a life, if only you had the wit and the art to read them. In such a world, to be born with an odd feature, a mark, a squint, a withered hand, a hunched back, was to carry through no fault of your own what your neighbours might read as the visible sign of an inward evil, and many a harmless soul went through life under a shadow cast by nothing more than the accident of their own face. And if the body could carry hidden meaning, so far more could speech, for the Tudor world believed with its whole heart in the power of the spoken word, to shape reality, to bless and to curse, to bind and to loose. Speech was not to them the light and disposable thing it has become to us. A word had force. An oath sworn was a solemn and binding act calling God to witness, and to break it was to invite his wrath. A blessing spoken over a person or a field or a departing traveller was a genuine act of protection, laying a true shield of good upon them, and a curse, spoken in anger with intent, was a weapon that could truly wound, that could bring down real misfortune upon the one it named, and that was feared accordingly. The dying were thought to have a special power in this, their last utterances carrying great weight, their blessing or their curse peculiarly potent, so that to be cursed by a dying parent was a dreadful thing to carry. A mother's curse, a beggar's curse, the curse of the wronged and the desperate were feared as real dangers, and much of the fear of the witch came down, in the end, to this, the terror of the muttered malediction that they all wished spoken at the door, the curse that might be idle or might be deadly and could not be told apart until the harm began. This is why blasphemy and profane swearing were taken so seriously and punished, for they were not mere rudeness, but a dangerous misuse of the tremendous power of holy speech, a scattering of sacred force in careless anger that could rebound on the whole community. And it is why the counter-charms and the blessings and the protective words mattered so much. For if a curse was a true weapon, then a blessing was a true defence, and the war of the unseen was fought, very largely, in speech. The curse and the blessing, the ill-wishing and the prayer, the malediction muttered at the threshold, and the holy name written on the folded paper worn against the heart. To live in that world was to know that what came out of a human mouth could reach out and change the world for good or ill, and to guard your own tongue, and to fear the speech of others, and to reach, when you were afraid, for the old strong phrases that had power in them, the names and the prayers and the blessings, and to set them, syllable by syllable, against the dark. But let us come back now to that man, the one who did more than any other to brand Anne Boleyn a witch and fix those false marks upon her forever. His name was Nicholas Sander, a Catholic scholar living in exile abroad during the long reign of Anne's daughter, Elizabeth. He hated everything the Tudors had done to the old faith, and he hated Elizabeth most of all, the heretic queen, the daughter of the marriage that had torn England from Rome. And so he set out, in a book written decades after the fact, to blacken the mother in order to taint the daughter. If he could make Anne Boleyn monstrous, unnatural, a creature marked by the devil, then Elizabeth herself became the fruit of a poisoned tree, her very right to the throne stained at the root. It was propaganda, cold and deliberate, and Sander was good at it. He had never laid eyes on Anne, who had died when he was a small child, but that did not stop him describing her in vivid and damning detail. She had, he wrote, a projecting tooth and a large wen or swelling beneath her chin, and upon her right hand a sixth finger. Each of these was chosen with care, because each was a recognized sign of the unnatural, the kind of blemish a superstitious reader would instantly connect with the diabolic. He was not simply insulting her looks. He was drawing, stroke by stroke, the portrait of a witch and inviting all of Catholic Europe to see the heretic Queen's mother for the marked and monstrous thing he claimed she was. The truth, so far as we can recover it, is far more ordinary and far more human. The one person who knew Anne well and left a sympathetic account, the grandson of a poet who had loved her, mentioned only that she may have had a tiny extra piece of nail upon one finger, a small thing, easily hidden, nothing like a sixth digit. No one who actually saw her in life, in all the years she was the most scrutinized woman in England, ever recorded that she had 6 fingers or a great growth upon her throat, and in a court seething with people who despised her and would have seized on any defect. That silence is deafening. Such a mark in that world would have been the talk of every embassy in Europe. It was not because it did not exist. Centuries later, when her remains were disturbed and examined, there was no trace of any 6th finger. The monstrous Anne was a fiction assembled after her death by an enemy who needed her to be a monster. But the fiction was powerful, precisely because it spoke the language of the Tudor imagination so fluently, the language of marks and signs and bodies that betray the soul. And that language was spoken not only about queens, it was spoken far more often and with far deadlier results about the poorest and least protected women in the land, because for every Anne Boleyn, remade into a witch by the politics of kings, there were countless ordinary women who fell under the same suspicion for reasons far closer to the ground. To find them, we have to leave the perfumed chambers of the court behind and go out into the villages, into the world of the cottage and the common and the parish church. And there we find a figure who stood all her life right on the dangerous line between the healer and the witch. She was the cunning woman, and her male counterpart the cunning man, and to understand the Tudor fear of witchcraft you have first to understand her, because she was not the enemy of that world's magic. She was its beating heart. Every community had one, or knew where to find one in the next village along. The cunning folk were the people you went to when ordinary life ran into trouble that ordinary means could not fix. If your child was sick and the usual remedies had failed, you went to the cunning woman. If your cow stopped giving milk, if your butter would not come in the churn, if a valuable object went missing and you suspected a thief, if you were in love and wanted to be loved in return, if you feared you had been cursed and needed the curse lifted, you went to the cunning folk, and they helped you for a small fee or a gift in kind with the tools of their trade. And their trade was magic, though they would rarely have used that word, and though the church frowned upon it and the law, as we shall see, increasingly forbade it. They knew the properties of herbs. They knew charms and blessings and the words to say over a sick bed. They could make an amulet to protect a traveller, a written charm to ease a birth, a spell to find lost property, or to turn a thief's own magic back upon him. They were, in a real sense, the doctors, the counsellors, the private investigators, and the priests of the poor, all rolled into one trusted and slightly frightening figure at the edge of the village. Their methods were many, and some of them survive in the records in vivid detail. To find a thief, or to recover something stolen, the cunning man had a whole repertoire of divinations. There was the trick of the sieve and the shears, in which a pair of open shears was balanced point down in the rim of a sieve, held up on the fingertips of 2 people, while the names of the suspects were spoken aloud one by one, and the sieve was watched to see at whose name it would tremble and turn. There was the key and the book, in which a heavy key was bound into the pages of a Bible at a chosen verse, and the whole thing suspended, and again the names recited, and the turning of the key taken as the finger of judgment pointing out the guilty party. To us these look like parlour games, but to the people who used them they were serious instruments of justice, ways of reaching past the limits of human knowledge to a source of truth that could see what no witness had seen. And many a village quarrel and many a real accusation began with a key turning in a Bible or a sieve trembling on the shears. The cunning folk stood too in a long and uneasy rivalry with the physicians, the licensed and educated doctors who served those who could afford them. The physician had his Latin, his university learning, his theory of the 4 humours and the balancing of hot and cold and wet and dry, his fees that only the prosperous could pay. The cunning woman had her herbs, her charms, her long-inherited practical knowledge of what actually seemed to help, and her willingness to be paid in eggs or a chicken or a day's labour, or nothing at all. And it is far from clear, looking back, that the poor who could reach only the cunning woman were worse served than the rich who could summon the physician, for the medicine of the learned was often useless and sometimes actively harmful, all its bleeding and purging and its elaborate theory, while the wise woman's brews at least did no harm and her presence gave comfort, and both of them, in the end, were mostly waiting for the body to heal itself or fail, as bodies will. The line between the doctor and the witch, like so many boundaries in this world, was not the line between knowledge and ignorance that we might expect. It was very largely a matter of class, and of license, and of who was permitted to heal, and who was merely suffered to. And here is the deep strangeness at the centre of it all, the thing that makes the Tudor attitude to magic so hard for us to hold in our heads, because it does not divide the way we expect. The cunning woman used magic to fight magic. When a family believed a witch had cursed them, it was to the cunning woman that they turned to lift the curse, to identify the culprit, to build the defences that would keep the evil out. She was the community's champion against the powers of the dark, and yet, by the strict letter of the belief, and increasingly by the letter of the law, what she did was itself witchcraft. She too worked with unseen powers. She too said words over objects and expected the world to change. The only difference in the end between the good witch and the bad witch, between the cunning woman who healed and the witch who harmed, was intention and reputation and luck. A cunning woman who helped you was a blessing. The very same woman, if your child died despite her charms, if you quarrelled with her, if the wind changed and the village turned against her, could become, overnight, the witch who had caused the harm in the first place. She lived her whole life balanced on that knife edge, useful and suspect in the same breath, and many of the women who ended their lives accused of witchcraft had spent those lives as the trusted healers of the very communities that turned upon them. It is worth staying with this figure a little, the cunning woman, because she is so easily lost between the two things she became in the historical memory, the harmless herb wife on the one hand, and the hunted witch on the other, when in truth she was a single, complicated, entirely real kind of person, and her working life had its own shape and its own year. She rose with the seasons and gathered as they turned, for every plant had its proper time, the leaf to be picked before flowering, the root to be dug in autumn when the virtue had gone down into it, the flower to be taken at midsummer when its power was greatest, and some things, the old knowledge insisted, to be gathered only at a certain hour, or under a certain moon, or with a certain word said over them, or they would not work. Her house would have hung with drying bunches, her shelves crowded with pots and bundles and stoppered bottles, and to the people who came to her door, one after another through the year, she was doctor and midwife and counsellor and confessor and finder of lost things, the person you turned to at every crisis of an ordinary life. And her reputation, on which everything depended, was made and unmade by the same rough machinery of talk that governed every life in a small community. A cure that worked, a lost ring found, a birth safely brought through, a curse lifted and the sufferer restored, and her name rose, and people came from further off and brought better gifts. But let a child die under her care, let a remedy fail at the wrong moment, let her quarrel with a powerful neighbour, or fall foul of a suspicious parson, and the same skill that had made her valued began to make her frightening, and the talk that had praised her turned, and the very cures she was known for became evidence that she had the power to harm as well as heal. She had always been standing on the line. She had spent her whole life on it, useful and a little feared, consulted and a little shunned, and whether she died in her bed an old and honoured wise woman, or on the gallows a convicted witch, depended not on anything she did differently but on luck, and on the mood of her neighbours, and on whether misfortune, when it came, as it always came, happened to fall in a way that pointed its long finger at her. It is worth following, step by step, how a mere grudge could climb all the way to the gallows, because the path was rarely a single dramatic accusation, and far more often a slow accumulation, a thing that gathered over years. It began usually in the ordinary friction of a small community where everyone knew everyone and no one could get away, in a quarrel over a debt or a boundary or a borrowed thing not returned, in a refusal of charity, and the muttered resentment that followed in the countless small collisions of people living too close together with too little to go round. A woman got a name for being sharp-tongued or odd or unlucky to cross. People began half-consciously to connect the misfortunes that followed their dealings with her, to notice and to remember and to talk. The talk hardened into a reputation, and the reputation preceded her, so that when trouble came to anyone who had crossed her, the mind leapt at once to the connection, and the fresh misfortune was added to the growing account. For a long time it might go no further than talk and wary avoidance. A woman shunned and whispered about, but not yet charged. What turned the slow poison of reputation into a matter of life and death was usually a single misfortune grave enough to demand a reckoning, above all a death, a child or a spouse or a valuable beast, striking soon after a quarrel with the suspected woman. Then the long-hoarded grievances of the whole neighbourhood came pouring out at once, every past quarrel and every unlucky coincidence dragged up and laid together, and what had been scattered mutterings became a case, brought before the local justice, sworn to by neighbour after neighbour, each adding their remembered grudge to the pile. The justice himself, a man of his time and its beliefs, took the depositions, and the machinery of the law engaged, and the woman who had been for years merely the unpopular old soul at the end of the lane found herself, quite suddenly, standing in a courtroom with her life in the balance, undone not by any single act, but by the slow gathering weight of her neighbour's fear, assembled at last into the shape of a capital crime. So the magic of Tudor England was not a rare and hidden thing, practised only by a sinister few. It was everywhere, woven through the whole fabric of daily life, and most of it was not sinister at all, but protective, defensive, a shield held up against a frightening world. To see how completely it saturated ordinary existence, we need only look at the small objects a Tudor family kept close, the charms they carried on their bodies and sewed into their clothes, because in these humble things we can see the fear and the hope of that world made solid, small enough to hold in a closed hand. A Tudor mother about to give birth faced one of the most dangerous passages a human being could undertake in that age. Childbirth killed women in appalling numbers, and killed the newborn in greater numbers still, and it did so without warning, and without any means of prevention that we would recognize as medicine. Into that terror, the magic of the age poured all its comfort. A labouring woman might have laid upon her belly or clutched in her hand a written charm, a strip of parchment inscribed with holy words, the names of saints, verses of scripture, sacred symbols, sometimes words that had long since lost any meaning and become pure magical sound, passed down and copied and recopied until they were gibberish, but powerful gibberish, trusted gibberish. She might wear a girdle blessed for the purpose, or a stone reputed to ease delivery, an eagle stone bound to the thigh. She might have about her herbs and amulets chosen to protect the coming child from the fairies who were known to covet human babies. All of this was magic, and much of it shaded into religion so seamlessly that no ordinary person could have told you where the one ended and the other began, and that seamlessness is the point. Prayer and spell were not opposites. They were points on a single continuum of ways to reach out and ask the unseen world for help. And where there was longing, there was magic. The human heart in that age reached for the unseen world, not only in terror, but in hope, and nowhere more tenderly than in matters of love. Young women, above all, wanted to know whom they would marry, and a whole gentle folklore of love divination grew up to tell them, practiced half in earnest and half in play, on certain charged nights of the year. On the eve of a saint's day, a girl might pare an apple in one long unbroken ribbon of peel, and cast it over her shoulder, and study the shape it fell into on the floor, hoping to read there the initial of her future husband's name. She might place herbs or a sprig of some particular plant beneath her pillow, and lie down in silence, and hope to dream of the face of the man she would wed. She might, with her friends, on a winter night melt lead or wax and drop it into cold water and pore over the strange shapes it hardened into, reading in them a trade or a fortune, an anchor for a sailor, a hint of wealth or of travel. These customs were softer and sweeter than the grim magic of the curse and the counter-curse, but they belonged to the same understanding of the world, the belief that the future was written somewhere and could be glimpsed, that the unseen powers knew what was coming, and might, on the right night and asked in the right way, let a hopeful girl catch one flickering glimpse of the shape of her own life to come. There is something very moving in these small hopeful rites when you set them beside the fear that ran through so much of the rest of this world. A young woman on the edge of her life, in an age when marriage would decide almost everything about her future, her home, her safety, her happiness, her very survival, and with almost no power to choose or to know, reaching out in the dark with an apple peel and a whispered wish, asking the night to show her who was coming. It is magic, yes, and it is superstition, but it is also simply the human longing to know the unknowable, dressed in the customs of its age, and it is not so very far from the ways we still, in quieter forms, try to read our own futures in the patterns life throws up around us. The written charm held a particular power, and this is worth pausing on, because it belonged to a world where most people could not read. To the illiterate majority, letters on a page were already a kind of magic, marks that bore meaning invisibly, that could speak a dead man's message or a distant king's command. It is not surprising that inked words were felt to carry power in themselves, quite apart from what they said. A charm written down and sewn into your clothing, kept in a little bag around your neck, folded into your shoe, worked upon the world by its mere presence. People carried inked prayers against the plague, against fever, against sudden death, against drowning, against the bite of a mad dog. They bore the opening words of the Gospel of John, held to be especially mighty. They wore strings of holy names and half-remembered Latin. And they believed with their whole hearts that these small folded papers stood between them and the disasters that were always waiting. And who is to say what such a belief was worth? To a frightened person in a perilous age, on a black night, with the wind rising outside and the children asleep in the loft and no other defence to hand. No disaster called out more of this frantic protective magic than the plague, which returned again and again through the Tudor century to empty streets and fill graves, striking without warning and killing with a speed and a horror that no medicine could touch. Against a terror so total, the people reached for every defence they had, and most of them were charms. Inked charms were carried against it, the same folded papers and holy names and scraps of scripture, worn on the body as a shield. People carried pomanders, little balls of sweet and pungent stuff, ambergris and musk and spices, or simply an orange stuck with cloves, held to the nose in the belief that the sickness travelled in bad air, in foul and corrupted smells, and that sweet strong scents could keep the poison out. They burned herbs and made smokes to cleanse the air of a house. They hung up charms whose words diminished, letter by letter, line by line, dwindling to a point in the belief that as the written word shrank away, so too would the disease it named. And they prayed, and they fled if they could. The rich abandoning the stricken towns for the country, and left behind them the poor who could not flee, to carry their pomanders and their papers and their prayers through streets where the doors of the sick were marked and the carts came for the dead. It is easy, from the comfort of an age that understands contagion, to smile at the pomander and the shrinking charm. But put yourself for a moment inside that world. A sickness is in your town that kills half of those it touches and kills them fast, and no one, not the wisest physician in the land, has the faintest true idea of what it is or how it spreads or how to stop it. You have children asleep in the next room. What would you not do? What charm would you not carry? What prayer would you not say? What sweet-smelling ball would you not press to your face as you hurried through the tainted streets? The magic against the plague was not the folly of stupid people. It was the only thing a loving and terrified people had to set against a horror that was otherwise completely beyond their power, and if it did nothing at all to stop the dying, it did perhaps one thing, which was to let a frightened soul feel that it had not simply surrendered, that it had done something, anything, to guard the ones it loved. But the body was not the only thing that needed protecting. The house itself, the small wooden and plaster shelter in which a family ate and slept and was born and died, had to be defended, and if you know what to look for, the marks of that defence survive to this day, scratched and burned into the old timbers of houses all across England. The Tudor family did not trust to prayer alone to keep the dark outside. They took tools in hand, and they marked their homes against evil, and those marks are one of the most moving traces the age has left us, because they are the fingerprints of ordinary fear, the physical evidence of people trying, with a knife and a candle, to keep their loved ones safe from powers they could not see. Go into an old enough house, a Tudor farmhouse, or a timber-framed cottage, or the crypt of a country church, and look closely at the wood, around the doorways, beside the windows, on the great beam above the fireplace, and you may find them. There are circles carefully drawn with a compass, and within the circles a pattern of overlapping arcs that makes a flower of 6 petals, a design the folklorists call a daisy wheel or a hexafoil. There are letters, most often a doubled V, 2 V shapes overlapping or set side by side, which stood for Virgo Virginum, the Virgin of Virgins, an appeal to Mary for protection, though people scratching it by then may have known only that it was the right mark to make. There are tangled, deliberate knots of loops, mazes with no way out, meant to catch and trap an evil spirit that tried to follow them, for it was thought that a demon was compelled to trace such a line to its end, and a track with no end would hold it forever. And there are burn marks, small teardrop-shaped scorches, made by holding a candle flame deliberately against the wood, most often near the hearth, where the chimney opened a great dark hole to the outside world, and to whatever might try to come down it. Each of these had its logic, and the logic tells us how the Tudor mind understood the geography of danger. Evil, it was thought, came in at the edges and the openings, the places where the sealed safety of the home was broken. A door is a hole in a wall. A window is a hole in a wall. A chimney is a great hole in the very roof, running straight up to the open sky. These were the weak points, the seams in the armour of the house, and so it was at exactly these points that the protective marks were cut, a ring of defence drawn around every place where the darkness might find a way in. The daisy wheel, with its endless overlapping curves, gave an evil spirit an impossible puzzle to solve before it could pass. The burn marks turned the devil's own weapon, fire, against him, a small controlled scorch that said, in effect, this house is guarded, this threshold is watched, you may not enter here. And people made these marks not once, but again and again, over generations, adding to them, refreshing them, so that the timbers of some old houses are crowded with the accumulated anxiety of centuries, layer upon layer of small desperate defences against the night. Some of the marks work not by holy meaning, but by pure entanglement, by giving an evil spirit a puzzle it could not leave. These were the endless knots and the little scratched labyrinths, lines that wound in upon themselves and came out nowhere, mazes with no centre and no exit, cut into a beam or a doorpost with patient care. The thinking behind them was strangely mechanical, almost like a trap laid for a mindless thing. A spirit that came upon such a line, it was believed, was compelled to follow it, to trace its every turn to the end, and a line that had no end would hold the creature forever, winding and winding, unable to break away, and unable to reach the sleeping family beyond. It is a curious glimpse into how the age imagined the powers it feared, not as all-knowing devils against whom nothing could avail, but as something that could be tricked, delayed, tangled up, and outwitted by a clever mark and a little patience. Number itself carried power, and the marks and the charms were full of it. 3 above all was a sacred and potent number, the number of the Trinity, and things were done 3 times over, repeated thrice, 3 circles burned into a beam, 3 knots tied, for the threefold repetition gave a charm its strength. 9, being 3 times 3, was more powerful still. 7 had its own holiness. The cunning woman gathering her herbs might pluck a certain number of leaves and no other, might tie a certain number of knots in her thread, might have the sufferer walk a certain number of circuits around a stone or a well, and the number was not decoration, but the very engine of the working, as essential as the words. In a world without our mathematics, but drenched in the symbolism of number, the counting and the careful repetition, that sacred 3 and the mighty 9 ran all through the practice of magic and protection. What more thread in the dense and intricate weave by which the Tudor mind tried to bind and order the dangerous powers of its world? And when marks upon the wood were not enough, the Tudor householder went further and hid objects inside the very fabric of the building. Secret objects walled up in the structure of the house to guard it from within. This is one of the eeriest of all the survivals from that world, because these things were never meant to be seen again. They were sealed into chimneys, buried beneath hearthstones, plastered into walls and packed under floors, hidden on purpose in the dark heart of the home, and there they waited, sometimes for 400 or 500 years, until a renovation or a demolition brought them suddenly back into the light. And the most powerful of them all, the people of that time seemed to have trusted above every other to fight a curse, was a small and deeply strange thing that we now call a witch bottle. A witch bottle was, on the face of it, an ordinary vessel, a stoneware jug or a glass bottle of the kind any household might own. What made it extraordinary was what went inside. The person who made one, or the cunning woman who made it for them, would fill it with an array of sharp and personal things. Iron pins and nails bent and broken, thorns, sometimes a small cloth heart stuck through with points, and, crucially, something of the victim's own body, most often their urine, sometimes hair or nail clippings. The logic was a logic of connection and reversal, and it was fierce and ingenious. A witch who had cursed you had, it was thought, formed a magical link to your body, a channel down which her malice flowed. The witch bottle attacked that link. It took a piece of you, your own bodily water, and then combined it with the pins and thorns, and then the whole thing was sealed up tight and either buried beneath the hearth, or, most dramatically, heated upon the fire. As it heated, the belief went, the witch at the other end of the magical link would feel the agony of the pins and the boiling, would be racked and tormented until she was forced to lift the curse and break the connection to save herself. The witch bottle did not defend against the witch. It counterattacked. It sent the pain back down the wire. There were gentler concealments too, though all of them carried the same charge of hope and dread. Shoes, above all, worn shoes, moulded by long use to the shape of a particular foot, were hidden in walls and chimneys in astonishing numbers, so many that the practice must have been almost universal, though it was so rarely spoken of that we have very few explanations for it in the words of the time. A shoe held the shape of its wearer, held something of the person, and perhaps that is why it was thought to catch and hold a wandering evil, or to stand guard, an empty sentinel walled up in the dark. Dried cats were sealed into buildings, their bodies sometimes arranged as if hunting, to catch the vermin and the evil spirits of the unseen world, as a living cat caught mice. Small cloth figures, poppets, were tucked away in the fabric of the house. And all of it, the bottles and the shoes and the cats and the marks, points to the same overwhelming preoccupation, the defence of the home, the sealing of the threshold, the ceaseless quiet war that every Tudor family waged, in the timbers and under the floors and above the door, to keep the living dark on the far side of the wall. The hidden shoe deserves a moment of its own, because it is at once the commonest of these concealments and the most mysterious, and because there is something about it that reaches straight across the centuries and takes hold of the heart. Shoes have been found walled into houses and chimneys in their thousands, all across the country, from grand houses and humble cottages alike, tucked into the fabric of the building at exactly the vulnerable points beside a hearth, above a door, under a floor, near a window. Nearly always they are worn, old, shaped by long use to the particular foot that wore them, and very often they are a child's. And the strangest thing of all is that we have almost no written record of why it was done. Unlike so many customs, which were argued over and written down and preached against, the hiding of the shoe was almost never spoken of, as though it were a thing everyone did and no one discussed, a piece of protective magic, so deep and so instinctive that it lived below the level of words. What we are left with is the object itself, and what it seems to say. A shoe holds the shape of a person as almost nothing else does. It keeps in its worn and moulded leather the very print of a living foot, the pressure of a particular way of walking, something intimate and individual and human. Perhaps that is why it was thought to draw and hold a wandering evil, standing guard in the black of the wall like an empty sentinel, catching any harm that came and holding it as it held the shape of its wearer. Perhaps it was left as a kind of offering, or a decoy, or a household god of the threshold. We do not really know. But when a builder today, taking down an old wall, finds a small worn child's shoe that someone, 400 years ago, tucked with care into the hidden heart of their home, and sealed up and never spoke of, meaning it never to be found, we are looking at one of the purest traces that survive of that whole vanished world of love and fear. A parent's silent, wordless spell against the dark, laid in the wall to guard a child who has now been dust for centuries. For the threshold was the great battleground, and the Tudor imagination returned to it endlessly, because the threshold was where the two worlds met. The doorway of a house was not merely a practical opening. It was a boundary in the deepest sense, the line between the safe, known, blessed inside, and the wild, dangerous, contested outside. And boundaries were where magic gathered, and where danger was greatest. A whole body of custom grew up around the crossing of that line. It was why a bride was carried over the threshold rather than allowed to step across it, lest she stumble at that charged and perilous point, and bring ill luck upon the marriage. It was why so much protective effort was concentrated exactly there, at the door, on the doorstep, on the frame. And the same was true of every other boundary and edge and crossing place in the Tudor world. Crossroads where paths met and parted were uncanny spots, the traditional site of unholy burials and midnight magic. The parish boundary was walked and beaten every year in a great communal ritual, partly to fix it in memory and partly to renew its power. Edges mattered, seams mattered. The points where one thing became another, dusk becoming night, land becoming water, the living year turning toward the dead months of winter, were the places where the veil between the ordinary world and the other one wore thin, and a wise person took care at such moments, and carried such defences as they could. Certain substances, too, were held to have a power of their own against the dark, and they turn up again and again in the customs of the age. Humble things kept close to hand in every household. Salt was one, precious and pure and incorruptible, sprinkled for protection, thrown over the shoulder to blind the devil who was thought to lurk behind a person on the left side, scattered in the corners of a new house or a birth chamber. To spill it was a grave piece of ill luck, a sign of coming sorrow, unless the mishap was at once mended by casting a pinch of the spilled salt back over the shoulder into the eyes of the waiting fiend, a gesture people still make, without a thought, to this very day. Iron was another, and it was proof against fairies and witches alike, so that a horseshoe, which was iron, and also carried the lucky shape of a crescent, and the sacred associations of the blacksmith's fiery craft, was nailed above the door of house and stable across the whole of the land, its two ends pointing upward, so that the good luck would not run out of it. A knife or a pair of open scissors, being iron and being sharp, was laid in the cradle or under the doormat or over the lintel. A nail from a coffin, a piece of cold iron carried in the pocket, the poker set against the grate in the shape of a cross, all of these turned the hard metal of the earth into a shield against the powers of the air. And then there were the gestures, the small movements of the body that carried protective force, done so automatically that most people would hardly have called them magic at all. The sign of the cross, made over a cradle or a loaf or a threshold, older than the Reformation and clung to long after it was frowned upon. Spitting, to seal a bargain, or to turn away ill luck, or to protect against the evil eye. The crossing of fingers, the touching of iron or of wood. The whole body in that world was a kind of instrument for managing the unseen, and a person moved through the dangerous day trailing a constant, half-conscious stream of these small defensive acts, a pinch of salt here, and a crossed finger there, and a quick sign made at a moment of fear, the way a modern person, who believes in none of it, will still knock upon wood and feel, for no reason they could name, a little safer for having done so. And just as certain places were charged and dangerous, so were certain nights, the turning points of the year when the veil between the worlds was thought to wear thinnest and the powers of the other side pressed closest. Chief among them was the eve that fell at the turn toward winter, the old feast of the dead, when the boundary between the living and the departed was believed to open, and the dead were abroad, and a person out after dark went in real peril of meeting them. It was a night to stay within doors, to keep the fire bright and the company close, to say the prayers for the dead who thronged so near, and, in the old faith, to ring the church bells long into the darkness, to comfort the souls in their pains, and to keep the evil spirits at bay. The eve of the 1st of May was another such threshold, the door into summer, a night of powerful and unruly magic when the fairies were abroad, and the dew held healing virtue and young people went out to the woods, and a night, too, when a wise householder took care to guard the cattle and the dairy, for it was a favoured time for witches to steal away the goodness of the milk. Midsummer Eve was a 3rd, the shortest night of the year, when fires were lit on the hilltops across the whole country, great bonfires that blazed from horizon to horizon, and people leapt through the flames and drove their cattle past the smoke for protection and health, and gathered the herbs that were most potent when picked on that one charged night. These were the hinges of the year, the moments when time itself turned and the ordinary order of things loosened, and the same instinct that took such care at the threshold of a house took care at these thresholds of the calendar, lighting the protective fire, ringing the protective bell, staying safe within doors, gathering the potent herb, because at these turning points the unseen world came close, and its powers, for good and ill, ran strong and near the surface, and a person who did not respect them did so at their peril. We keep the husks of these nights still in our bonfires and our costumes and our small survivals, long after the fear that filled them has drained away, and it is worth remembering on such a night what it once truly meant, when the dead were felt to be walking, and the dark between the worlds stood open. Among the strongest of all the household's defences were the ones that grew in the garden and the hedgerow, for the Tudor world drew no clean line between the healing power of a plant and its power to ward off evil. The knowledge of herbs was vast and old and held largely by women, passed from mother to daughter and from wise woman to apprentice, and it worked on two levels at once, the medicinal and the magical, which to the Tudor mind were not really two levels at all, but one. A plant that could soothe a fever could also soothe a haunting. A root that purged the body could also purge the house, and certain trees and plants bore a particular reputation as guardians against the powers of the dark, and were planted close to the home, or cut and hung above the door, or carried on the person, for exactly that reason. Chief among them was the rowan, the mountain ash, with its clusters of blazing red berries, which was held to be proof against witchcraft above almost any other growing thing. A rowan tree beside the door protected the whole house. A sprig of rowan carried in the pocket, or a small cross of rowan twigs bound with red thread and hung over the byre, kept the witches from the cattle and the milk. The hawthorn, the may-tree, was powerful too, though dangerous and double-edged, deeply protective in some customs, and deeply unlucky in others, especially if its blossom was brought indoors. Holly, with its fierce evergreen spines, guarded against evil and against lightning. The yew, dark and ancient and long-lived, stood in the churchyards as a guardian of the dead. Witch hazel was cut and used to divine for water and to ward off the very thing its name recalled. And the mighty oak, rarely struck by lightning, was held to offer protection from the storm, so that a piece of oak worn on the body, or the old charm of an acorn upon the window-sill, was thought to keep the lightning from the house. All of this was botany and medicine and magic braided together into a single strand of knowledge, and the wise woman who knew it was a formidable and valuable figure, right up until the moment the same knowledge marked her out as dangerous. Some plants carried a darker and stranger reputation still, and chief among them was the mandrake, the root that grew, it was said, in the rough shape of a human body, with something like a head and limbs, and that screamed when it was pulled from the ground, a scream so terrible that it would kill or madden anyone who heard it. To gather one safely, the old law held you had to loosen the earth about it and then tie a dog to the root and withdraw to a safe distance and let the dog, in straining to follow, draw the shrieking thing out of the ground and die in your place. The mandrake was prized as a powerful charm, for love and for fertility and for protection, and pieces of it were carried and treasured, and lesser roots, brownie and others, were carved and shaped and sold to the credulous as the true and costly mandrake by the cunning traders of the age. It is a perfect example of the way the Tudor mind saw the whole green world as charged with hidden power and hidden peril, so that even a root in the earth might be a living thing that screamed, might be a treasure or a danger, might have to be gathered with ritual and cunning and a sacrifice, and might, once won, stand between its owner and every kind of harm. Other plants had their gentler virtues and their appointed uses, and the wise woman knew them all. Vervain, gathered with the right words at the right hour, was potent against enchantment. St. John's wort, hung in the house or worn on the body, drove away evil spirits and the melancholy that was half believed to be their work. Mugwort and plantain and betony each had their place in the great unwritten pharmacopoeia of the countryside, part medicine and part magic, and the woman who carried that knowledge in her head, gathered over a lifetime and passed down from the women before her, held something genuinely valuable, a working understanding of the plants of her place and their powers, which is the ancestor of real medicine, and was, in its own age, as close to healing as most people would ever come. Because here is where the whole shining, protective, hopeful world of Tudor magic turned its dark face toward us, and we come to the engine that drove the real terror, the thing that turned a neighbour into an accuser and a healer into a hanged woman. That engine was misfortune, and the human refusal to believe that misfortune is ever truly random. When something terrible happened in a Tudor village, when a healthy child sickened and died in a week, when the best cow swelled up and perished in the field, when the butter would not come however long you churned, when a strong man was struck down with a wasting illness that no remedy could touch, the people of that world could not, shrug and call it bad luck. Misfortune to them had causes, and causes had faces, and when you began to search for the face behind your suffering, you did not have to search far, because it was almost always the face of someone you knew. Nowhere did misfortune bite deeper, or magic press closer, than in the great anxious business of the farming year, on which every life depended, for a failed harvest meant not inconvenience but hunger, and hunger meant death. And so the whole cycle of ploughing and sowing and growing and reaping was hedged about with custom and charm and ritual. Each meant to coax the fickle earth into yielding and to guard the precious crop from the many powers that might blast it. There were the right days to plough and the right days to sow, read from the almanac and the moon. There were blessings said over the seed and the field. At harvest, when the last of the corn was cut, there were customs old beyond memory, the plaiting of the last sheaf into a figure, a corn dolly, in which the spirit of the harvest was thought to be caught and kept safe through the winter, to be returned to the ground in spring, and the crying of the harvest home, and the feast that crowned the year's hardest labour. In the orchards, in the depth of winter, people went out to the apple trees to wassail them, to drink to them, and sing to them, and make a great noise among their branches, waking them and blessing them, and driving off whatever might harm them, so that they would bear well in the year to come. And all of this was magic, of a gentle and hopeful and communal kind, and it grew directly out of the terrible uncertainty of the enterprise. A farmer put his seed in the ground and then waited, for months, at the mercy of the weather and the seasons and the unseen powers, unable to do anything more to protect the crop on which his family's life depended, and into that long, helpless waiting, he poured every ritual and blessing and charm that might tip the balance toward plenty and away from ruin. And when, despite it all, the crop failed, the frost came late, or the rain came wrong, or the blight fell upon the corn, the same searching for a cause and a face began that we have seen everywhere else. And the failed harvest, like the dead child and the soured milk, could find itself blamed on the ill will of a neighbour, on the evil eye cast over the field, on the witch who had blasted the crop out of spite. The magic that blessed the fields and the fear that hunted the witch were the two faces of a single thing, the overwhelming, year-in and year-out helplessness of people whose survival hung on forces they could not control and did not understand, and who reached, with everything they had, for any means at all of bending those forces their way. This was the belief in the evil eye, and in maleficium, harmful magic, and it worked through the ordinary frictions of village life in a way that was quietly devastating. Consider how it went. A poor old woman, perhaps a widow living alone on the edge of the community, dependent on the charity of her neighbours, comes to your door to beg a little food, a scrap of bread, some milk, a place by the fire, and you, having little enough yourself, or simply out of sorts that day, turn her away, perhaps sharply, perhaps with hard words. She goes off muttering, resentful, as anyone would be, and her muttering sounds to your uneasy ear like curses. And then, a week later, your child falls ill, or your cow dies, or you yourself are seized with pains, and your mind, casting about for the cause, lands with terrible ease upon that moment at the door, that turned away old woman, that muttered curse. She did this. She ill-wished us. She had the power and she had the grudge, and now see what has befallen us. The guilt you felt at turning her away curdles conveniently into fear and then into accusation, and the old woman, who had nothing in all the world but her reputation and the tolerance of her neighbours, finds that reputation turning to poison around her. It is a terrible mechanism, and what makes it so terrible is how human it is, how understandable at every step. The need to explain suffering, the refusal to accept blind chance, the buried guilt over a small unkindness, transformed into the certainty that the injured party has struck back with hidden powers. The way suspicion, once it settled on a person, gathered each past oddity to itself, each sharp word she had ever spoken, every quarrel, each unlucky thing that had ever followed a disagreement with her, and until a whole case was assembled out of the ordinary bad luck of years and laid at one frightened old woman's door. The accused witches of Tudor England were overwhelmingly poor, overwhelmingly female, overwhelmingly old, and overwhelmingly alone. The widows and the spinsters and the beggars, the women with the fewest defenders and the sharpest tongues and the least ability to fight back. They were not powerful figures wielding dark forces. They were the most vulnerable people in the village, and the magic attributed to them was, more often than not, the only power anyone could imagine such a person having, the power of the curse, the last weapon of the weak. The witch of the popular imagination did not work alone. She was believed to keep about her small animal servants, familiars, imps in the shape of beasts, given to her by the devil to do her bidding, and this belief runs through the English witch trials like a dark and vivid thread. The familiar might be a cat, a dog, a toad, a rat, a mouse, a ferret, a bird, some ordinary small creature that a lonely old woman might well keep for company, and that suspicion transformed into a demon in disguise. It was thought that she fed these creatures from her own body, from the witch's mark, that hidden teat which the searchers looked for upon the flesh of the accused, and that in return they carried out her spiteful errands, creeping into a neighbour's house to sicken a child, or spoil the beer, or blast the crop. The trial records preserve their names, homely and absurd and chilling all at once. The little imps called by pet names, described by frightened witnesses, and confessed to by broken old women, and there is nothing in the whole story sadder than the thought of a solitary widow's only companion, the cat that shared her fire, being written down in the record of the court as the demon that would hang her. The witch was thought able, too, to leave her own shape behind, and take the form of a beast, and above all the form of a hare, and there are countless tales, told all across England, of the hare that could not be caught or killed, that led the hounds a wild chase and vanished, and of the old woman found afterward in her cottage, breathless, or bearing a wound in the very place the huntsman's shot, or the dog's teeth had struck the fleeing hare. The shape-shifting witch, the storm-raising witch who could whistle up a wind to wreck the ships or becalm them, flatten the standing corn, bring down the killing frost, these were the figures of nightmare and of winter's tale, the dark counterpart to the helpful cunning woman, and though the accused who actually hanged were almost always powerless old women, whose worst real weapon was a bitter tongue, it was against this towering imagined figure, the servant of Satan with her familiars and her storms and her power to take the shape of the running hare, that the whole machinery of fear and law was truly raised. And this fear did not stay at the level of the village and the soured milk and the dead cow. It ran all the way up, because the Tudor mind read warnings not only in the misfortunes of the household, but in the great book of the sky itself, where God was thought to write his intentions for kings and kingdoms in letters of fire. To look up at the Tudor night sky was to look at something we can barely imagine now, a sky undimmed by any earthly light, blazing with more stars than most modern people have ever seen, and across that sky, from time to time, there moved signs that stopped the breath of everyone who saw them. Chief among these were comets, the blazing stars, the hairy stars, as they were sometimes called, that appeared without warning, hung burning in the heavens for days or weeks, and then vanished. To the Tudor world, a comet was never a neutral event, never a mere curiosity of nature. It was a portent, a message, an omen of disaster, and above all it was thought to foretell the death of kings and the fall of nations. There was even a law of how to read them, so that a comet trailing its light in one fashion foretold the death of a great ruler, while one that streamed its fire in another manner foretold the ruin of a whole country, war, plague, famine, upheaval. When a comet appeared, people watched it with dread, and waited to see what catastrophe it had come to announce. And because the world of that age was rarely without a catastrophe of some kind for long, a war, a death, a bad harvest, a visitation of plague, the comet was almost always felt to have been proved right. The sky had sent a warning, and then the warning had come true, and each time it happened the whole system of belief was confirmed and strengthened, and the next blazing star was watched with even greater fear. Not all reading of the sky was a matter of comets and dread, though, for the same heavens that sent the great portents also had to be read every single day for the far more immediate and practical question of the weather, on which the whole of life on the land depended. And here the Tudor countryman was a shrewd and close observer, and had built up, over uncounted generations, a great body of weather lore that was half folk wisdom and half genuine and hard-won observation. The colour of the sky at morning and evening was watched and read, the red sky that promised fair or foul. The behaviour of the animals was studied, the cattle lying down, the swallows flying low, the cat washing behind its ears, the distant hills seeming to draw near, the smoke that hung low or rose straight, all taken as signs of the weather to come. The moon was watched, its ring foretelling rain, its clearness or its haze read for the days ahead. The very ache of an old wound or a stiff joint was consulted as a barometer of the coming damp. Much of this was real knowledge, dressed in the language of sign and omen, but grounded in a lifetime of watching, the accumulated observation of people whose survival depended on guessing right about the sky, and a good deal of it holds true and is understood by science today. But it shaded, as everything in this world shaded, into the other kind of reading, into the belief that the weather could be sent, that a sudden devastating storm at harvest was not mere chance, but might be the work of a witch who had raised it out of spite, that the killing frost or the ruinous flood had been called down by ill will, that the very winds could be bought and sold and commanded by those who had the dark art of it. The line between reading the weather and blaming the weather on a human enemy was, like every other line in this age, uncertain and easily crossed, and the same countryman who shrewdly read the red morning sky and the low-flying swallow might, when the storm he foresaw broke ruinous over his ripe corn, look not only to the heavens, but to the cottage of the old woman he had quarrelled with, and wonder. Eclipses did the same work, and perhaps did it more powerfully still, because there is nothing in all of nature more primally frightening than the sun going dark in the middle of the day, or the full moon draining to the colour of blood. To a people who did not understand the clockwork of the heavens, who saw the sun as God's own lamp and the appointed ruler of the day, its sudden failure was a thing of horror, a wound in the order of the world, a sign that something was deeply and dangerously wrong. Such events were remembered for generations, tied in memory to whatever disaster had followed them, and woven into the great chronicle of signs and warnings by which the Tudor age made sense of its own history. The sky was a book, and disaster was its subject, and everyone knew how to read, at least a little of it, and no one who saw a comet burning over England slept quite easily until they knew what it had come to say. And you did not need a comet or an eclipse to read the future, for the Tudor world was thick with smaller signs, and a person alert to them was never without a warning or a promise. Birds, above all, were messengers. The magpie, seen alone, foretold sorrow, and to this day people who could not tell you why will greet a lone magpie or count them anxiously by the old rhyme. The raven and the crow, black and carrion feeding, were birds of ill omen, and to hear one croak over a house where someone lay sick was to hear the announcement of a death. An owl crying by day, a bird that flew down the chimney or beat against the window, a hen that crowed like a cock, all of these were dreaded as tokens of coming misfortune. A small beetle that ticked in the timbers of an old house was called the death watch, its faint knocking heard by the fearful and the sleepless as the counting down of a life. And when a death did come to a household, custom required that the bees be told of it, that someone go quietly out to the hives and inform the bees that their master was dead, and drape the hives in black, lest the bees, uninformed and offended, sicken and die or fly away, taking the luck of the house with them. Dreams, too, were read for their hidden meanings, for in sleep the soul was thought to loosen its hold on the body and to wander closer to the unseen world, and so to catch, sometimes, a true glimpse of what was coming. There were dream books, lists of images and their meanings, that told you a dream of muddy water foretold trouble, and a dream of clear water good fortune, that to dream of teeth falling out foretold a death in the family, that certain visions were warnings and others promises, and beneath all these particular signs lay the whole vast web of everyday luck, the countless small rules that governed a careful life. It was unlucky to walk under a ladder, to pass another person on the stairs, to put shoes upon a table, to spill the salt, to break a mirror, to see the new moon through glass or over the left shoulder. It was lucky to find a horseshoe, to touch iron, to carry a caul, the birth membrane that some babies were born with, which sailors prized above almost anything as a charm against drowning. A person moving through a Tudor day was reading, constantly and half unconsciously, a world dense with meaning, in which almost nothing was merely itself, and almost everything was also a sign. Some people, it was believed, could read that world of signs far better than others, being born with a gift for it, and the age was full of these figures with the second sight, the ones who saw what others could not. A child born with a caul, the thin membrane sometimes drawn over the face at birth, was thought to be marked for luck and for uncanny gifts, protected from drowning all its life, and perhaps able to see spirits or foretell death. And the caul itself was dried and kept and prized, and sold at high prices to sailors as the surest charm against a watery grave. A seventh son, or the seventh son of a seventh son, was held to have inborn powers of healing and of sight. And here and there, in this village and that, there were men and women simply known to have the gift, to dream true, to feel a death before its news arrived, to see the shadow of what was coming, and the neighbours half feared and half consulted them, uncertain whether such a gift came from God or from somewhere darker, but rarely doubting that it was real. Nowhere was the reading of signs more constant or more deadly earnest than at sea, for the sailor lived closer to sudden death than almost anyone, and clung the harder to every charm and omen that might keep him alive. A sailor would carry his call against drowning and mark the birds and the winds and the colour of the sky and the behaviour of the sea for their warnings, and observe 100 rules about what must and must not be done or said aboard a ship, what days were unlucky to sail, what words were unlucky to speak. When the strange fire of a storm played blue about the masts, that eerie glow that sometimes crawls along the rigging in wild weather, the sailors watched it with awe and read it as a sign, a saint's own light come to watch over them, or an omen of the storm's outcome. The sea was the most dangerous road a Tudor man could travel, wholly beyond his control, ruled by powers vast and pitiless, and the dense web of charm and omen, and rule that the sailor wrapped himself in was his only defence, the one thing that let him push out onto that terrible water at all, and believe, against all the evidence of every storm, that he might yet come home. And the earth answered the sky, for the Tudor world found its omens not only in the heavens, but in the strange and terrible things that were sometimes born upon the ground. A monstrous birth, as they called it, an animal or a child born badly malformed, was one of the most charged and frightening events that could befall a community, and it was read, like the comet, as a message from God, a sign of divine anger, a warning to a sinful people to mend their ways before worse befell them. These were not hidden away and passed over in silence. They were reported, discussed, written up, and printed, and the printed accounts of them form one of the strangest bodies of literature the age produced. When the printing press met the ancient dread of the malformed birth, something new and lurid was born, the broadsheet of the monster, a single printed sheet describing, and often crudely illustrating, the latest prodigy to appear somewhere in the land, with a sensational account of its deformities and a stern religious verse explaining what it meant and why God had sent it. The great chronicler Holinshed, whose history the Tudors read and whose pages later fed the imagination of their playwrights, recorded a whole crop of such wonders for a single year in the early 1560s. In that year he wrote, "A mare in England brought forth a foal with one body and two heads, and something like a long tail growing between them. A sow gave birth to a piglet, with 4 legs shaped disturbingly like the arms of a human child, with something like arms and fingers. Another sow farrowed a piglet with 2 bodies and 8 feet and a single head. Calves and lambs were born malformed across the country, some with strange collars of skin about their necks that people compared, uneasily, to the ruffs and neckerchiefs that fashionable folk were then wearing, as if nature itself were mocking the vanities of the age. Each of these was taken as a sign, and the signs were read as warnings. God did not send a 2-headed foal for nothing. He sent it because the people had grown proud, or greedy, or ungodly, and he was showing them, in the flesh of their own beasts, the distortion and corruption of their souls, and calling them to repent before the true punishment fell. And where a human child was born malformed, the terror and the meaning were greater still, and the poor mother often bore the added burden of a whispered suspicion that her own sin, or some fault in her conduct while carrying the child, had brought the deformity about. In one famous case, a pair of joined twins born in the reign of the boy king was taken by many to represent the divided and unhappy state of the realm itself, the rival claimants to the throne bound together in one struggling body. The birth chamber, already a place of danger and dread, became also a place where the fate of kingdoms might be read in the body of a newborn, and where a private tragedy could be seized upon and turned into a public omen, printed and sold and poured over the length of the land. These printed wonders were part of something new and important, for the age of the Tudors was the first great age of cheap print in England, and print changed utterly the way that marvels and portents travelled. Before, a strange birth or a fearful apparition in a remote village would have been known only locally, told and retold as rumour, spreading slowly by word of mouth and fading as it went. Now it could be written up, printed on a single sheet or a few, illustrated with a crude and startling woodcut, and carried by pedlars and chapmen the length and breadth of the land, sold cheap at fairs and markets and on street corners, read aloud to the illiterate in the alehouse and the market square. A monstrous birth in a distant county became, within weeks, a wonder that all England could shudder over, its meaning confidently explained in a few lines of grim religious verse, its lesson driven home, its terror spread far beyond the place it happened. And it was not only monstrous births. The presses poured out a whole literature of wonders and warnings, of strange apparitions in the sky, of rains of blood and armies seen fighting in the clouds, of great fish cast up on the shore, of comets and floods and fearful judgments upon sinners, of the latest witch discovered and the latest execution done. This was the news of the age, and it was news of a particular kind, news as omen, news as warning, the events of the world presented, not as mere happenings, but as messages, signs of the times, tokens of God's pleasure or wrath, calls to a sinful people to repent before the end. The Tudor reader, poring over a printed sheet about a two-headed calf or a blazing star or a witch's confession, was not reading for idle curiosity alone. They were reading the world for its hidden meaning, scanning the flow of strange events for the warnings they were sure it contained, and the new power of print did not weaken that ancient habit of mind, but fed it and spread it, and gave it a reach and a speed it had never had before. But not all reading of signs was a matter of dread and disaster. There was a whole art of the heavens that stood, in the Tudor mind, on the very edge of respectability, practised by learned men, consulted by the powerful, and taught in the universities, and that was astrology. We tend to file astrology today alongside the other discarded beliefs of the past, a harmless amusement at best. But to the Tudor world it was something close to a science, perhaps the queen of the sciences, a vast and intricate body of knowledge that claimed to read the influence of the stars and planets upon every earthly thing, and that commanded the serious attention of some of the most educated minds of the age. To understand why the stars were thought to rule the earth, you have to understand the shape of the whole universe as the Tudor imagination pictured it, for it was a very different cosmos from ours, and a strangely comforting one. The earth sat still at the centre of everything, and around it turned the heavens, not as empty space, but as a series of vast crystalline spheres, one within another, each carrying its planet, the moon nearest, then the sun and the wandering planets, and outermost the sphere of the fixed stars, and beyond them all the heaven of heavens where God kept his court. It was a finite, ordered, enclosed universe, snug as a nest of shells, and every part of it was linked to every other, in a great chain of correspondences that ran from the highest angel down to the meanest stone. As there was a king among men, so there was a sun among the planets, a lion among beasts, an eagle among birds, gold among metals, and each answered to the others, and a change in one part of the great order rang through all the rest. To never. In such an universe, the influence of the stars upon the earth was not magic at all, but simple physics, the natural pouring down of power from the higher and more perfect spheres onto the lower and grosser world beneath. Everything hung together. Everything meant something. The metal in the ground, the herb in the field, the organ in the body, the planet in its sphere, all were bound in one vast web of sympathy and correspondence, so that the right herb gathered under the right planet could heal the organ that answered to them both, and the whole of medicine and magic and astrology was one single science of reading and using these hidden connections. It was wrong, of course, in almost every particular, but it was beautiful, and it was whole, and it gave to the people who believed it something we have arguably lost, an universe in which they were not a speck of accident in an indifferent void, but the very centre of a meaningful order, not watched over from above, connected to everything, held in a cosmos that made sense from top to bottom, and in which nothing, not the fall of a sparrow, nor the birth of a monster, nor the blazing of a star, ever happened without a reason. The reasoning behind it was coherent, and on its own terms, almost compelling. The heavens were understood to be perfect, unchanging, and divine, wheeling in their great ordered circles above the corruptible earth, and it seemed only natural that these mighty perfect bodies should pour their influence down upon the lower world and shape what happened there. The sun plainly governed the seasons and the growth of crops. The moon plainly governed the tides, and it was believed, the humours of the body and the cycles of women. If the two great lights had such power, why not the planets? Why not the stars, each with its own character and force? Mars hot and warlike, Venus gentle and loving, Saturn cold and heavy and slow. And if the whole configuration of the heavens at any given moment shaped the character of that moment, then a skilled reader of the skies could do remarkable things. He could cast a horoscope for a newborn child and read in it the shape of the life to come. He could choose an auspicious day for a great undertaking, a marriage, a journey, a coronation, and avoid the days when the stars were set against it. He could even, some claimed, foretell the future course of events for a whole kingdom. And astrology did not stay locked in the studies of learned men and the chambers of kings. It came down into the ordinary household in the most Tudor of forms, the printed almanac, which was, after the Bible and the prayer book, very nearly the best-selling printed thing of the age. An almanac was a small, cheap booklet, renewed every year, and it was a marvel of practical magic for daily life. It gave the calendar and the movable feasts and the phases of the moon. It gave the positions of the planets and the signs they stood in. And from these it drew a whole scheme of advice, the lucky days and the unlucky ones, the good times and the bad for every undertaking, when to plant and when to reap, when to wean a child, when to buy and sell, when to begin a journey, and above all when it was safe to be bled, for the letting of blood was the great cure-all of the age, and it had to be done under the right sign, or it might do more harm than good. Ordinary literate households kept an almanac and consulted it as we might consult a calendar and a weather forecast and a horoscope all at once, and through it the grand cosmic scheme of the astrologers, the wheeling planets and their powers, reached right down onto the kitchen table and shaped the small decisions of the farming year. There was one kind of star reading, though, that the crown watched with a wary and jealous eye, and that was prophecy, the foretelling of the fate of kings and kingdoms. For a prophecy could be a dangerous political weapon, a whispered prediction that a king would die by a certain year, that a dynasty would fall, that a great change was coming, could stir up rebellion and give heart to traitors, and so the making and spreading of prophecies about the state was viewed by the Tudor government as something close to treason, and laws were passed against it. The age was haunted by old prophecies, some fathered on the ancient wizard of legend, some on shadowy folk prophets, and one on a figure who became, in later memory, the very type of the country seer, the woman remembered as Mother Shipton, a supposed prophetess of Yorkshire, whose dark sayings were printed and reprinted and expanded and invented for generations after any real woman who might lie behind the legend was gone. Whether she ever lived, and if she did what she ever really said, is lost entirely beneath the centuries of embroidery. But the appetite that kept her legend growing was real, the deep Tudor hunger to believe that the future had been foreseen, that somewhere the pattern of things to come had been read and written down, and that the frightening open darkness ahead was, to the right eyes, already known. Kings and queens took this seriously and kept astrologers about them, and Henry VIII himself had such a man in his service to read the heavens on his behalf. For a monarch, the appeal was obvious: to know the future even a little, to choose the fortunate moment and shun the unlucky one, was a power worth having, and the line between this respectable, learned, courtly astrology and the darker arts of the village conjurer was one that the practitioners themselves were always anxious to draw and defend. The astrologer was a scholar, a mathematician, a reader of the divine order written in the stars. He was not, he would insist, a sorcerer trafficking with spirits. And yet the line was thin, and it could be crossed in an instant, and no life shows this better than that of the most famous of all the Tudor astrologers, a man who advised a queen and chose the very day of her crowning, and who spent his later years bent over a crystal, straining to speak with angels. His name was John Dee. John Dee was one of the most learned men in Europe, and one of the strangest, and his life ran like a bright thread through the whole later Tudor age. He was a brilliant mathematician at a time when mathematics itself was regarded by many ordinary people as a kind of sorcery, since the man who could work with numbers and angles and hidden proportions seemed to command a secret and unnatural knowledge. He was an astronomer, a geographer, an advisor to navigators setting out to find new worlds, the owner of the greatest private library in England, thousands of volumes gathered at a time when books were rare and costly, a collection that scholars crossed the sea to consult. And he was all his life a seeker, after the hidden wisdom he believed lay behind the visible world, a man who could not rest at the edge of knowledge but always pressed on, past mathematics into astrology, past astrology into alchemy, and at last past alchemy into the perilous attempt to summon and question angels. It is hard for us now to grasp how dangerous the mere possession of learning could be in that world, how close, in the popular mind, the scholar stood to the sorcerer, a man who could read the strange characters of Greek and Hebrew, who filled his rooms with books in tongues no ordinary person understood, who worked through the night by candlelight over diagrams and figures and instruments of brass, who knew the courses of the stars and the properties of metals and the secret meanings of numbers, seemed to his unlettered neighbours to command a knowledge that was not natural, and knowledge that was not natural could only come from one of two sources, from God or from the devil. Mathematics above all carried this taint. To the common eye there was no difference between the geometer casting his figures and the conjurer casting his circle, between the astronomer's calculation and the magician's spell, and a man who could predict an eclipse or reckon the hidden proportions of things was more than half suspected of trafficking with spirits to do it. The word for a skilled reckoner and the word for a conjurer were, in that age, very nearly the same word, and Dee complained bitterly all his life of being taken for a caller-up of devils, when he was, as he saw it, only a servant of true and lawful knowledge. A great library like his, thousands of volumes gathered from across Europe at ruinous expense, was itself an object of awe and suspicion, a treasure house of forbidden-seeming wisdom that drew scholars from far off to consult it, and in the end drew the fear and greed of the mob as well, for when Dee was abroad in later years his house was broken into and his precious books and instruments scattered and destroyed by people who seem to have regarded them as the dangerous apparatus of a wizard. There is a real pathos in it. The learned man who wanted only to know, to push back the darkness of ignorance and reach the hidden order of the world, and who was rewarded by his own age with the reputation of a devil worshipper and the ruin of his life's collection, and it stands as a sharp reminder that in this world the border between knowledge and magic was not a line the learned could safely stand behind. It ran right through the middle of learning itself, so that the very pursuit of truth could mark a man as a sorcerer, and the deeper he went into the real secrets of nature, the more surely his frightened neighbours took him for a servant of the dark. His gifts brought him close to the throne. When the young Elizabeth came to power, after the frightening years under her Catholic sister, she turned to Dee for a service that tells us a great deal about the mind of the age, because this was not some ignorant villager consulting a hedge conjurer, but the new Queen of England, one of the sharpest intelligences of her time, seeking the counsel of the stars at the most important moment of her life. She asked John Dee to choose the date of her coronation. It was not to be picked for convenience, nor for the usual reasons of a holy day or a season, but calculated by the art of astrology to fall at a moment when the heavens stood in the most favourable possible arrangement, so that the reign begun beneath them would be blessed with long life and glory and success. Dee bent to his charts and his calculations and named his day, a day in the deep of winter, in January of 1559, and on that day, chosen by the stars, Elizabeth Tudor was crowned, and the reign that followed became one of the most celebrated in all of English history. Whether the stars deserve the credit is not a question. The Tudor world would even have thought to ask. To them, the Queen had begun her reign wisely, under a sky read by the most learned man in the land, and the long golden age that followed was exactly what such wisdom was supposed to buy. But Dee's story also shows how narrow and how dangerous the path was, even for the most respectable practitioner, because there had been an earlier time under Elizabeth's sister Mary, when the very same skills had nearly destroyed him. In those years Dee had cast horoscopes, and among them, fatally, horoscopes of the Queen and of the Princess Elizabeth, and to calculate the stars of a reigning monarch was to skirt perilously close to treason, for it might mean calculating the hour of her death, and to imagine the death of the sovereign was itself a capital crime. Dee was arrested and imprisoned and examined on charges that hovered between conjuring and treason, and though he escaped with his life, he had felt the ground open beneath him. The astrologer who chose a queen's crowning day had also lain in a cell for reading the same stars a few years before. The art was the same, only the favour of the powerful had changed, and that is the whole difference between the honoured scholar and the imprisoned conjurer, a difference not of what a man did, but of who was pleased or threatened by it. And in his later years, this most learned of men passed over a line that even many of his contemporaries thought he should never have crossed. No longer content to read the stars, Dee wished to speak directly with the spirits who, he believed, governed the hidden workings of creation, and to that end he took up the practice of scrying, of gazing into a polished crystal or a dark mirror in the hope of seeing visions. Since he could see nothing himself, he worked with another man who claimed the gift, a mysterious and probably dishonest character who peered into the stone and reported the angels he saw and the messages they spoke, while Dee, in perfect faith, wrote it all down. For years the two of them laboured at this strange communion, filling books with the messages of angels, convinced they were receiving the deepest secrets of the universe. It ruined Dee in the end, or helped to. He died old and poor and half forgotten, the Queen who had honoured him long gone, his great library scattered and plundered, remembered by the common people less as a scholar than as a wizard, the very thing he had spent his life insisting he was not. His fate is the fate of the whole Tudor art of the heavens in one man, the perpetual, unstable, dangerous nearness of learning to magic, of the scholar to the sorcerer, of honour to ruin. Dee had pursued, among his many studies, the greatest and most secret of the age's hidden arts, alchemy, and it deserves a word of its own, for it was not the mere greedy fraud we sometimes imagine. On its surface, alchemy was the quest to transform base metals into gold, to find the philosopher's stone that would accomplish that transmutation, and, some believed, confer long life or even immortality besides. And there were frauds and dreamers enough who ruined themselves and others chasing it. But to its serious students, alchemy was something deeper and stranger, a sacred science of transformation, a belief that all matter was alive and growing and striving toward perfection. That lead was simply gold that had not yet ripened, and that the alchemist, working with his furnaces and vessels through long labours of heating and dissolving and distilling, was assisting nature in her slow work of perfecting creation and perfecting in the process his own soul. It sat, like everything else in this world, on the uneasy border between what we would call science and what we would call magic, and in truth it was the ancestor of both, the direct forerunner of chemistry, with its actual furnaces and real vessels and patient, systematic experiment, and at the same time a mystical and spiritual quest wrapped in secrecy and symbol and dream. The alchemist in his smoky laboratory, surrounded by his strange apparatus and his coded books, poring over the colours that rose and changed in his flask, was a figure of fascination and suspicion, a man meddling with the deepest secrets of matter, and whether he was a natural philosopher on the road to real knowledge or a conjurer trafficking with forbidden powers was, once again, a question the age could not cleanly answer, because the two were not yet separate things. They were one pursuit, one reaching out of the human mind toward the hidden workings of nature, and out of that single tangled root would grow, in time, both the science that would remake the world and the magic that mankind would slowly leave behind. There is a deep irony in the fact that the Queen Dee served, the sharp and sceptical Elizabeth, became in her own reign the centre of a kind of enchantment more powerful than anything in his crystal. For Elizabeth and those around her did something extraordinary with the magical imagination of their age. Rather than merely fear it or consult it, they harnessed it and turned it into an instrument of royal power, wrapping the Queen herself in a shimmering mythology of the marvellous until she became, in the eyes of her subjects and her poets, a being almost more than human, a fairy queen. This was a bold and strange thing to do, and to feel its strangeness we have to remember what the fairies actually were to the Tudor mind, because they were not then the small, sweet, harmless creatures they have since become. The fairies of Tudor England were beings of real power and real menace, uncanny, unpredictable, living just beyond the edge of the human world and often bitterly hostile to it. To many, and especially to the newly Protestant, they were half-allied with the devil, deceiving spirits, dangerous to meet and dangerous to name. And into this genuinely frightening territory the image-makers of Elizabeth's court walked deliberately and claimed it for the Queen. In the great poem of the age she was figured as the Queen of Faerie, the radiant sovereign of an enchanted realm, worshipped and served by her knights. In the pageants staged for her on her journeys about the country, she was met by figures out of legend and myth, by nymphs and fairies and the personified spirits of the land, all bowing to her, all owning her as their mistress. The message was subtle and superb. Here was a queen so glorious that even the powers of the other world, the very fairies that ordinary people feared to speak of after dark, acknowledged her sovereignty and did her honour. The magic of the age, instead of threatening the crown, was made to kneel before it. This was only the most dazzling instance of a thing the crown did all the time, which was to clothe itself in the supernatural and to draw upon the deep well of wonder in the popular mind. The monarch was already, by the belief of the age, a sacred being, set apart by the holy oil of the coronation, ruling by the appointment of God, and around that core of sacred kingship, the Tudors and their servants built a whole shimmering structure of image and spectacle designed to overwhelm the beholder and to bind loyalty with awe. The progresses through the country, in which the queen moved among her people in a slow tide of splendour, were partly practical and partly a kind of enchantment, the living presence of the anointed sovereign carried out to be seen and marvelled at. The portraits, with their strange and deliberate symbolism, their emblems and mottos, and their queen who never seemed to age, were not mere likenesses but icons, images meant to be read and revered. The whole art of Tudor monarchy was an art of the marvellous, a controlled and cultivated magic of majesty, and it worked upon the same faculties in the human mind, the same hunger for wonder and for a power greater than the everyday, that the village charm and the fairy tale worked upon, only turned to the service of the state. There is a deep logic in it. In an age that saw hidden power everywhere, that believed the world to be shot through with the supernatural from the stars to the hearthstone, the ruler who wished to command that world's obedience had to be more than a mere administrator of laws. He or she had to seem to partake of the sacred, to stand at the meeting point of earth and heaven, to be a figure of awe and mystery as well as of power. And so the same imagination that feared the witch and dreaded the comet, and left the coral on the baby and the shoe in the wall, looked up at the anointed monarch, and saw there too a being touched by the unseen, a holy and half-magical figure, whose hands could heal and whose person was sacred, and gave to the crown a loyalty that was not merely political, but reached down into the same deep ground of wonder and dread from which all the rest of this world grew. It was a way of making a woman ruler, in an age that mistrusted the rule of women, into something unassailable and awe-inspiring, a figure of legend rather than merely a mortal queen. And it worked so well that we have half forgotten it was ever a bold stroke at all, so thoroughly that the phrase fairy queen now seems merely pretty to us rather than the daring appropriation of a feared and dangerous power that it truly was. But beneath the glittering court myth, out in the villages and the cottages and the dark lanes, the real fairies of the Tudor imagination went on being feared exactly as they always had been, and nowhere was that fear sharper or more agonizing than around the cradle of a newborn child. For the fairies wanted human children, and this was one of the most heartbreaking of all the beliefs of that world, because it grew directly out of the unbearable frequency with which Tudor children sickened and died. A healthy baby, thriving 1 week and wasting the next, failing before its parents' eyes with no cause anyone could name, was an agony that the modern world can scarcely imagine, and it happened constantly, in every family, in every village, over and over. The belief in the changeling was, at bottom, a way of holding that agony, of giving it a shape and a story, even a terrible one, rather than facing the sheer meaningless cruelty of it. For it was said that the fairies coveted human infants, and that they would creep to the cradle of a beautiful and healthy child and steal it away into their own country beneath the hills, leaving in its place one of their own, a changeling, a fairy child or a bewitched piece of wood given the seeming of a baby, and the changeling would not thrive. It would sicken and fret and waste and cry and fail to grow because it was not the true child at all but a substitute, a counterfeit left in the cradle while the real baby was carried off into the hollow hills forever. The world of the fairies had its own geography, and a careful person learned to respect it. There were places that belonged to them, and were dangerous to disturb, the green rings in the grass where they were said to dance by night, which a wise person would not step into, the ancient thorn tree standing alone in a field, which no one would cut for fear of what kept it, the old mounds and barrows in the landscape, the hollow hills under which their country was thought to lie. There were paths that were theirs, invisible roads across the land along which they travelled, and it was unlucky and perilous to build a house across such a way, so that a cottage plagued by trouble might be blamed on its standing in the road of the fairies. And there were rules for dealing with them, learned and passed on and taken with deadly seriousness. You did not thank them, for to thank them was to offend. You did not name them directly if you could avoid it, but spoke of them in soft and flattering terms, the good folk, the fair family, the gentry, lest the true word draw their attention. And above all, if you ever found yourself in their country, you did not eat their food, for to taste the food of the fairies was to be bound to their world forever, unable ever to return fully to the land of the living. For the deepest dread of the fairies was not that they would harm you, but that they would take you, carry you off into their beautiful and terrible country under the hill, from which few came back, and those who did came back wrong, having been away, as they thought, a single night, to find that 7 years or a lifetime had passed in the world of men, everyone they loved, grown old or dead, themselves strangers in their own place. This was the fairy peril at its heart, the theft not only of babies from the cradle, but of the living from the world, the young man who followed the music and was never seen again, the girl who lay down to rest by the wrong hill and vanished, the loved one gone without trace whom the family, unable to bear the blankness of it, could tell themselves was not dead but taken, alive still, somewhere just out of reach, in the country of the good folk beyond the edge of the fields we know. You can see, with a kind of aching clarity, what this belief was doing. A mother whose baby was failing could tell herself that this wasting, wailing creature was not truly hers, that her real child, her healthy, beautiful baby, was alive still, somewhere, taken but not dead. It was a story that both explained the horror and, in its strange way, softened it, and it was believed with complete sincerity, and it shaped how people acted. Guards were mounted over cradles. A whole armoury of protections was deployed to keep the fairies from the newborn, for the child was thought most vulnerable in the days before it could be baptized, when it belonged fully neither to this world nor to the safety of holy ground. Iron, which the fairies could not abide, was laid in or near the cradle, an open pair of scissors, a knife, a horseshoe. The baby was watched and never left alone in that dangerous interval. And above all, the bells of the parish church were rung at the baptism, and at other times, because the sound of hallowed bells was thought to drive back the powers of the air, and to make a canopy of holy noise beneath which the vulnerable child was safe. In the ringing of the church bells across the Tudor countryside there was, among all the other meanings, this one, a mother's terror for her baby, and the whole community's effort to hold the hungry fairies back from the cradle for one more night. The mother herself was in a dangerous and set-apart state in the weeks around a birth, and a whole web of ritual surrounded her too. The lying-in chamber was a world of women, sealed and darkened and warm, from which men were excluded, and in which the mother was tended and watched through the perilous days of her delivery and her recovery by the gossips, the women friends and neighbours who gathered to see her through. And when at last she was well enough to go out again, she did not simply return to ordinary life. She went first to the church, to be churched, to take part in the old ritual of thanksgiving and purification that received her back, after the strange and dangerous passage of childbirth, into the everyday community of the living. Until she was churched, she was, in the old feeling that lingered long after the reformers frowned on it, still marked by the birth, still in an uncanny in-between condition, and there were those who thought it unlucky for her to cross a neighbour's threshold or to walk abroad freely before the rite had set her right. Birth, like death, was a crossing between worlds, and the mother who had stood at that crossing carried something of its danger about her until the proper ritual had closed the door behind her. The child, once born and safely delivered, was armoured against the unseen world with every charm its family could provide, and the most beautiful of these was coral. A branch of red coral, or a string of coral beads, was hung about a baby's neck or given to it to hold, for coral was believed to guard the child against the evil eye, and against fits and frights and the malice of witches and fairies, and to grow pale, some said, if the child it protected sickened, and to glow bright red again as health returned. Look at the old portraits of Tudor and later children, and you will see the coral there, again and again, a red bead or a coral rattle in a small plump hand. And it is not merely an ornament, it is a shield. It is a parent's love and a parent's terror made into a bright object and placed in the hand of a vulnerable child, one more small defence in the endless quiet war to keep the little ones safe, in an age when so very many of them could not, in the end, be kept safe at all. And if the fairies pressed close about the beginning of life, other presences pressed close about its end, for the Tudor world was profoundly, restlessly haunted by its dead, and the great religious upheaval of the century made that haunting stranger and more troubling than it had ever been before. To see why, we have to understand what the Reformation did to the geography of the afterlife, because it was one of the most disorienting changes the age underwent, and it left the living and the dead in a new and unsettling relation to one another. Pork. In the old faith, the faith of the centuries before Henry's break with Rome, there had been a clear and comforting map of what came after death. The very good went to heaven, and the very bad to hell. But most ordinary souls went first to a middle place, purgatory, there to be cleansed of their sins through suffering before they could rise to God. And the crucial thing about purgatory was that the survivors could help the dead who suffered there. By their prayers, by masses said for the departed, by acts of charity and remembrance, they could shorten the pains of their dead and speed them on their way. This bound the living and the dead together in a great web of mutual obligation and love. The dead were not gone, they were waiting and suffering and could be helped, and the whole community, past and present, was joined in one long chain of prayer stretching down the generations. The Reformation swept purgatory away. The Reformers declared it a fiction, unfounded in Scripture, and with it went the whole apparatus of prayers and masses for the dead. At a stroke, the elaborate traffic between the quick and the departed was declared meaningless. The dead were gone wholly and finally, beyond the reach of any help the survivors could offer, sped instantly to their eternal reward or their eternal punishment, with nothing in between and nothing to be done. For many this was meant as a liberation, a lifting of a great burden of fear and obligation and expense, but it left a raw and aching wound in the emotional life of the people, and it left a puzzle that would not go away, which was the simple, stubborn fact that people went on seeing ghosts. The dead went on, appearing to the living, in dreams and at deathbeds, and in lonely places, exactly as they always had, and now there was no comfortable framework to explain them. If the dead could not return from heaven, and could not return from hell, then what was the grieving widow seeing at the foot of her bed? The official Protestant answer was stern and frightening, that such apparitions were not the dead at all, but demons in disguise, evil spirits wearing the beloved face to deceive and damn the living. But in the hearts of ordinary people, the older belief lingered stubbornly on, that the dead did sometimes return, restless, unquiet, with unfinished business, or a wrong to be righted, or a warning to give, and the Tudor night was haunted, as much as by anything, by this unresolved argument about the dead, this uncertainty at the very heart of grief about what, exactly, was walking in the dark. And the dead who walked in the belief of the people were not the peaceful dead, but the troubled ones. For a soul at rest stayed at rest, and only the unquiet returned. The murdered came back, above all, unable to lie still while their killing went unavenged and their killer walked free, appearing at the scene of the crime or at the bedside of the guilty, pointing, accusing, demanding justice. And there were many a tale of a murder brought to light by the walking of the victim, the ghost that would not rest until the truth was told and the murderer hanged. The dead who had died with a promise unkept, a debt unpaid, a treasure hidden and its place untold, a wrong undone, might return to set the matter right, and could sometimes be spoken to and asked what they wanted, and laid to rest at last when their business was finished. The suicide and the unbaptized and the drowned, who could not lie in hallowed ground, were especially restless, their spirits bound to the lonely crossroads and the water's edge where their bodies lay outside the peace of the church. The land itself was marked with the places where the dead were felt to linger, that there were haunted houses and haunted lanes and stretches of road that people would go far out of their way to avoid after dark. There were the lights that hovered over the marshes and the graveyards, the corpse candles and will-o'-the-wisps that were read as tokens of a coming death, or as the very souls of the dead, luring the unwary from the path. There were the black dogs, huge and spectral, with eyes like coals that padded the old roads and boundaries and churchyards, whose appearance foretold a death. To walk home alone across country on a dark night, past the churchyard and the crossroads and the pool where someone had drowned, was to walk through a landscape densely peopled with the dead and the uncanny, every shadow a possibility, every sound a question, and to be very glad indeed of the charm in your pocket and the sight of your own lit window at last, and the living warmth of the house closing safe around you against all that waited in the dark outside. When a haunting would not cease of itself, when the dead thing kept returning and the household could bear it no longer, there were ways, it was believed, to lay the troublesome spirit to rest. This was work for someone with power over the unseen, most often a priest, or several, and it was a solemn and sometimes fearful business. The ghost might first be spoken to, questioned, asked what it wanted and why it walked, for many a haunting was thought to spring from an unfinished thing, a wrong to be righted, a debt to be paid, a body lying unburied, a message to be delivered, and once the living had done what the dead required, the spirit could depart in peace. But where a ghost could not be satisfied, or would not go, it might be laid by stronger means, compelled by prayer and ritual and holy words into some confinement, bound and shrunk and commanded away, banished into a pool or a bottle, or driven off to some far and lonely place, made to depart, in the old phrase, to the far distant sea, there to trouble the living no more. There is something both frightening and oddly comforting in these rituals of laying, for they meant that even the dread of the walking dead was not without remedy, that the terror had its answer, that the household besieged by a ghost was not simply helpless, but could send for one who knew the words and the ways to make the haunting stop. And it tells us, too, something about how completely this world hung together, for the same church whose bells rang out the soul and whose priest could lay the restless dead was also the church of the blessed candle and the holy well and the sign of the cross, and the powers it wielded against the dark were of a piece with all the rest. The great sanctioned magic of religion set against the wild and dangerous magic of the night, offering to a frightened people not only an explanation of the terrors that surrounded them, but at least sometimes a means of driving those terrors back and winning, for the living, one more night of peace. Against all this fear, this thronging world of witches and fairies and comets and unquiet dead, the Tudor age set one last and greatest source of protective power, and it sat, quite literally, upon the throne. For the monarch was believed to be more than a mere ruler. The King or Queen of England was a sacred figure, anointed with holy oil at the coronation, set apart from and above ordinary humanity, a channel of divine power upon the earth. And the most striking proof of that sacred power, the place where the magic of monarchy became visible and physical and available to the humblest subject, was the royal touch, the ancient belief that the hands of the sovereign could heal disease. The disease in question was a wasting affliction of the neck and throat, a swelling and ulceration of the glands, which was so closely associated with this royal cure that it came to be known simply as the king's evil, an evil that the king, and only the king, could drive away. The belief was old, older than the Tudors, reaching back to the sainted English king of centuries before whose holy touch was said to have healed the sick, and the Tudor monarchs inherited it and practiced it, and drew from it a deep confirmation of their own sacred standing. The ceremony itself was a solemn and moving thing, and it drew great crowds of the desperate whenever it was held. The sick came from far off, having heard that the sovereign would touch the poor and the afflicted with their swollen and ulcerated necks, gathering and waiting for their turn before the anointed presence of the ruler of England. There were prayers and readings from Scripture, the passages that told of the laying on of hands and the healing power of God. And then, one by one, the sufferers were brought forward, and the monarch laid royal hands upon their sores, and their words of blessing were spoken over them, and the sufferer passed on, having stood, for one moment of a hard life, in the very presence of majesty. For a poor labourer or a sick child from a distant village, it must have been the most extraordinary hour of an entire existence, to be brought out of the anonymous multitude and to have the crowned and anointed sovereign of the whole realm reach out and touch their ordinary suffering flesh. Whether the sores truly closed mattered, of course, but perhaps less than we might think. Even for those who were never cured at all, the day had given them something no physician ever could, a moment of hope, of dignity, of nearness to something far greater than themselves, and a story to tell for the rest of their lives. In an age with so little comfort for the poor and the sick, the royal touch cost the sufferer nothing, and gave them, at the very least, the sense that the highest power in the land had stooped to notice their pain, and that the healing force of the crown had been turned for one moment upon their own suffering. And there was a further gift. To each person touched, the monarch gave a coin, a small piece of gold, which was pierced, so that it could be hung about the neck on a ribbon and worn ever after. This was the touch piece, and it was itself a powerful charm, a physical token of the royal healing, carried away by the sufferer, and kept as a treasure and a protection, a fragment of the sacred power of kingship that could be held in the palm and worn against the skin. To receive the royal touch and the golden coin was to be brought, for one extraordinary moment, into direct contact with the divine authority of the crown, to have the anointed hands of the ruler of England laid upon your ordinary suffering flesh, and whether or not the disease then healed, and many cases of the king's evil did in fact come and go of their own accord, which only strengthened the belief. The experience must have been overwhelming, a moment of hope and awe and sacred contact in lives that held little enough of any of them. There were other places too where the sacred and the healing met, and one of the oldest and most enduring was the Holy Well. All across England there were springs and wells that had been reverenced for as long as anyone could remember, waters that welled up out of the ground and were held to have the power to cure, each often with its own saint and its own speciality, this one good for sore eyes, that one for skin diseases, another for barren women who longed for a child. To such a well the sick and the desperate would journey, sometimes long distances, to bathe the afflicted part, or to drink the water, or to leave an offering, a pin dropped into the spring, a rag tied to the branches of the tree that overhung it, a small token left in exchange for the hoped-for cure. The reformers disapproved of all this, of course, as they disapproved of pilgrimage and the cult of the saints, and they pulled down the shrines that had grown up at the greater wells and tried to break the people of the habit. But the wells themselves could not be pulled down, and the water went on flowing, and the people went on coming quietly, out of an instinct far older than any church, to the places where the earth's own water rose up clean and cold and was felt somehow to carry healing in it, and the rag-hung trees beside the old wells of England kept their fluttering offerings for centuries, and in some remote places keep them yet. And when all the wells and the charms and the touches had failed, as in the end they always did, death itself was ringed about with its own great body of ritual and belief, for the passage out of life was the most dangerous crossing of all. As a person lay dying, the passing bell was rung from the parish church, a slow tolling that told the whole community a soul was going, and asked their prayers, and served also, in the older understanding, to frighten away the evil spirits that were thought to gather about a deathbed, waiting to seize the soul as it left the body. Windows might be opened to let the soul fly free, and mirrors covered or turned to the wall, lest the departing spirit be caught in the glass, or lest the living who saw themselves reflected beside the dead be marked for the grave in their turn. The body was watched over, waked, never left alone between death and burial, and in some country places there lingered the strange and touching figure of the sin-eater. A poor outcast paid a little bread and ale and a coin to take upon himself, symbolically, the sins of the dead, eating them away over the coffin, so that the departed soul might go lighter to its judgment. Every stage of it, the tolling bell, and the opened window, and the covered glass, and the watched body, was a way of managing the terror of dying, of easing the soul across the last and darkest threshold, and of protecting the living from the powers that gathered wherever the door between the worlds stood open. The royal touch shows us something important about everything we have been walking through tonight, which is that its magic was not all fear and darkness. Here was a form of power that was gentle, hopeful, healing, sought out by the desperate and given freely by the crown, a magic of contact and mercy rather than of curse and dread, and it sat at the very summit of the same great structure of belief, whose lower reaches held the witch bottle and the changeling and the mark of the devil. The Tudor age was drenched in the supernatural from top to bottom, from the anointed monarch healing with a touch to the frightened widow muttering at a cottage door, and it was all, in a sense, one thing, one vast shared conviction that the visible world was everywhere shot through with invisible power, and that the great work of a human life was to attract the good power and repel the bad. But that conviction had a terrible edge, and we cannot leave this world honestly without looking steadily and without flinching at what it did to the people it turned upon, at the machinery of the law that the fear of witches finally set in motion. For the fear we have traced through cottage and cradle and churchyard did not remain a matter of private dread and homemade charms. In the Tudor century it hardened into law, and the law brought the full weight of the state down upon the accused. It was under Henry VIII, in the year 1542, that the first English law was passed making witchcraft a crime to be tried, not by the church but by the ordinary courts, and punishable by death. That first act was soon repealed, but the principle had been established, and it returned for good under Henry's daughter Elizabeth. In 1563, a new statute made witchcraft once again a serious secular crime, and drew the fatal distinction that would shape the trials to come, that to cause harm by witchcraft was a grave offence, but to cause death by witchcraft was a hanging matter. From that point on, the accusation of witchcraft was not merely a social poison, but a legal charge that could end with a woman's life, and over the decades that followed, in a steady and sorrowful stream, it did. It is worth being clear and calm about what this meant and how it was done, because the popular picture is often wrong. In England, unlike in Scotland and in much of Europe, the convicted witch was not burned. Burning was the penalty reserved for heresy and for certain kinds of treason. The English witch, found guilty under the law, was hanged, put to death on the common gallows like a thief or a murderer, plainly and without ceremony. There was no systematic use of torture in the English courts as there was elsewhere, and the great mass witch hunts, the trials that consumed whole districts, largely came later, in the troubled years after the Tudor age had passed. The methods used to test an accused woman were, even so, their own kind of ordeal, and they followed directly from the beliefs we have already seen. Because the devil was thought to seal his servants with a mark, the body of the accused would be searched for it, examined for any patch of skin that seemed unnatural, any blemish that might be the sign of the pact or the teat from which a familiar fed, and a suspicious spot might be pricked with a pin to see whether it would bleed or feel pain, for the true devil's mark, it was said, was dead to sensation. It was a grim and humiliating business, and it fell, like everything else, hardest on the old and the poor and the friendless women, stripped of their dignity and searched by their neighbours for the marks that would damn them. There was also, in the popular mind more than in the sober practice of the early courts, the notion of the water test, the idea that a witch, having renounced her baptism, would be rejected by the pure water and float, while the innocent would sink. This grim piece of folk reasoning became far more notorious in the darker years that followed the Tudor age, when the great hunts came, but its roots lay in exactly the tangle of ideas we have been tracing, the body as evidence, the pact as a physical fact, the guilt that could be read in flesh and water and blood. What strikes one most, reading the records of these examinations, is not cruelty for its own sake, but a terrible earnestness, a genuine and methodical attempt to determine the truth by the only means the age believed in. The men who searched and questioned and pricked were not for the most part sadists enjoying their power. They were officials and neighbours doing what they sincerely believed was necessary and just, applying the tests their world trusted, following a logic that was, given its premises, entirely coherent. That is the truly disturbing thing about it, and the thing most worth carrying away. The horror of the witch trials was not, in the main, the horror of evil people. It was the horror of ordinary, sincere, frightened people, operating a system of belief that was internally consistent and utterly wrong, and grinding up the innocent inside it with the calm conviction that they were doing right. But the machinery was now in place, and its victims were, as they had always been, the poor, the old, the isolated, and above all the women. The typical accused was not a powerful figure, but a defenceless one, an old widow living alone at the margin of a community that had used her and feared her, and now, when misfortune came, turned upon her. She would be examined, and her body searched for the devil's mark, and her neighbours would come forward with their long-hoarded grievances, every quarrel and every piece of bad luck that had ever followed a hard word from her, and out of that accumulated fear a case would be built, and sometimes she would hang. We can watch the whole terrible process at work in one real case, the most famous of the early English trials, which unfolded in the county of Essex a few years after Elizabeth's law was passed. In the summer of 1566, 3 women from one small village were brought before the judges at Chelmsford. They were a widow known to her neighbours as Mother Waterhouse, a woman in her 60s, her sister, and her grown daughter, and among them there passed a single strange possession that lay at the heart of the case, a cat. Not an ordinary cat, the accusers said, but a familiar, a demon in the shape of a white-spotted cat that had a name, and the name was Sathan, and that could speak, and that had been kept and fed and passed from one woman to another, and set on to do harm. Mother Waterhouse confessed, whether from fear or confusion or in some hope of saving her daughter we cannot now know, that she had kept the creature, and fed it, and sent it out to do her spite, to sicken cattle and spoil the brewing, and at last to bring about the death of a neighbour. It was that last confession, the causing of a death, that under the new law meant she must die. Her daughter was found not guilty and let go. Her sister, whose harms had stopped short of killing, was given a prison term. But Mother Waterhouse herself was condemned, and on a July day in 1566 she was hanged at Chelmsford, one of the very first women to go to the gallows under Elizabeth's witchcraft law, going to her death. The account says confessing her guilt and begging the forgiveness of God. And here is the detail that shows us how the new world of print had joined itself to the old world of fear, for the whole affair was at once written up and published. The confessions and the courtroom scenes, and even a description of the execution set down in a cheap pamphlet and sold to a public hungry for exactly this kind of dark sensation. The story of Mother Waterhouse and her speaking cat became, in effect, one of the first pieces of true crime reporting in the English language, printed and poured over the length of the land, and every reader who shuddered over it had the whole framework of witch belief confirmed and deepened in their mind, and was made that little bit readier to look hard the next time misfortune struck at the lonely old woman down the lane and the cat that sat by her fire. There is a bleak and important lesson buried in all of this, and it is not the easy one that the past was simply stupid and cruel, and that we have grown wise. The people who accused their neighbours were not monsters, and they were not, by the standards of their own knowledge, being irrational. They lived in a world without the germ theory of disease, without any real understanding of why a child sickened or a cow died or a harvest failed. They lived amid constant, inexplicable, devastating misfortune, and they possessed a rich and coherent framework that explained that misfortune, and better still, offered ways to fight it. When your child is dying and you do not know why, and everyone around you knows for a certainty that such losses are caused by ill-wishing, and there is a woman down the lane with whom you quarrelled, and who has a reputation, the accusation does not feel like cruelty or madness. It feels like understanding. It feels like justice. It feels like doing something, at last, against a horror that would otherwise be utterly beyond your control. The tragedy of the witch trials is not the tragedy of wicked people doing wicked things. It is the far more unsettling tragedy of frightened, grieving, ordinary people reaching for the only explanations their world had given them, and destroying the innocent in the process. And yet, even in that age, not everyone believed. This is a thing worth holding on to, because it is tempting to imagine the whole Tudor world as united in a single dark conviction, every soul from the king to the ploughman, equally certain of witches and their powers. It was not so. There were doubters and skeptics, and men who looked hard at the whole edifice of witch belief and pronounced it nonsense, and the greatest of them wrote his doubt into a book that has come down to us. He was an English country gentleman, a man of Kent, a member of Parliament, learned and stubborn and humane, and in the year 1584 he published a work whose very title announced its purpose: the discovery, the uncovering, the exposing of witchcraft. In it he set out to prove that the whole business was a delusion. The confessed witches, he argued, were poor, old, melancholy, muddled women, more to be pitied than feared, who had persuaded themselves of powers they did not possess. The wonders attributed to them were either natural events misunderstood, or the tricks of cheats and conjurers, and to show how those tricks were done he described them in careful detail, laying bare the sleight of hand behind the seeming miracle, so that his book became, almost by accident, one of the first ever written to explain the art of the illusionist. And the persecution of these wretched women, he declared plainly, was irrational, unjust, and profoundly unchristian, a cruelty dressed up as godliness. He was a voice ahead of his time, and he paid the price of it, in ridicule and in anger. When the Scottish king who would later rule England came to write his own book on the subject, he attacked this sceptical Englishman by name, and the story went about that when that king came to the throne he ordered the doubting book to be gathered up and burned. But it was not forgotten. It was read and argued with and read again, and it stands for us now as the proof that the Tudor mind was never a single thing, that even in the deepest years of the fear there were people who kept their heads, who looked at a frightened old woman and her cat, and saw not a servant of Satan, but a lonely human being wronged, and who had the courage to say so in print, against the current of their whole age. The darkness was real, and the fear was real, and the deaths were real. But so always was the small stubborn light of those who refuse to believe, and it is as much a part of the true picture of this world as any charm or curse, and a part we do well to remember. There is one more turn to the story, and it is the strangest of all, because it forces us to ask a question we have been circling all evening. What, in this world, actually counted as superstition, and what counted as true faith, and who decided? And the unsettling answer is that across the Tudor century the line moved again and again, and that one person's holy practice became, almost overnight, another person's damnable magic, depending entirely on which side of the great religious divide they stood. Before the Reformation, the old Church of England had been rich with practices that involved blessed objects and sacred power working directly upon the physical world. There was holy water, blessed and sprinkled, and carried home to protect the house and the fields and the sick. There were the relics of the saints, the bones and fragments enshrined in the greater churches, to which people made long pilgrimages in hope of healing. There were blessed candles and holy medals and consecrated bells, and the sign of the cross made over a cradle or a cooking pot or a threshold. There were the saints themselves, a vast company of heavenly helpers, each with a speciality, one invoked against toothache, and another against fire, and another for safe childbirth, and another for lost objects, an entire system of sacred aid, woven into the smallest corners of daily life. To the medieval Christian, none of this was magic. It was religion, the ordinary blessed commerce between earth and heaven, and it gave comfort and structure to millions of lives. And it ran on a great wheel of the seasons, a calendar of feast days and seasons that shaped and sweetened the whole of ordinary time, and that was itself full of the mingling of faith and folk custom, of blessing and magic, that the reformers would find so hard to tell apart. At the turning of winter came Candlemas, when the candles for the year were brought to the church and blessed, and carried home to be kept for protection, lit in the sick room and the birth chamber and against the storm. For a blessed candle was a powerful thing, a piece of holy light to set against the dark. That there was the blessing of the throats, and the blessing of the fields, and Plough Monday when the plough itself was brought into the church and blessed before the labour of the year began. In the spring came the days of Rogation Tide, when the whole parish walked its boundaries in procession, beating the bounds, the priest blessing the crops in the ground, and the entire community fixing in memory and renewing in ritual the sacred edge of their own place, and the children were bumped against the boundary stones so that they would never forget where the line ran, and that all of this gave the calendar a shape and a rhythm and a running thread of the sacred, so that a person moved through the seasons accompanied at every turn by blessing and ritual and sacred custom. The plough blessed, and the candles blessed, and the fields blessed, and the bounds walked, and the great feasts kept, and the whole of ordinary working life was woven through with the presence of the divine. And it is easy to see, when you look at it whole, why the stripping away of so much of it left such an ache. The reformers had their reasons, and serious ones, and to them much of this was the very superstition they were bound to root out. But to the people who had lived inside that blessed and ordered year all their lives, its loss was not a liberation, but a bareness, a cold new world in which the candles were no longer blessed, and the fields no longer walked in procession, and the old bright wheel of hallowed time was broken, and they were left to face the dangers of the year with far fewer of the comforts that had carried their parents and grandparents through. And it was all of this, in the end, that the reformers looked at and called by a different name. To the Protestant eye, this was not faith at all, but superstition, even magic, a degraded and idolatrous confusion of the holy with the material, treating holy water as a charm, and the saints' bones as talismans and the mass itself as a kind of conjuring trick. They tore it down, smashed the shrines, poured out the relics, stripped the images from the walls, silenced the invocation of the saints, and declared that God was reached by faith and by his word alone, not through blessed objects and sacred things. And so, for the traditionally minded people of England, the world was suddenly turned upside down. The very practices that had been the heart of holy protection all their lives, the water, the candles, the beads, the saints, were now condemned as superstition and forbidden, while the reformers who condemned them seemed, to the old believers, to have stripped the world bare of its defences and left the people exposed and defenceless before the powers of the dark. And the stripping was not only a matter of ideas and forbidden practices, it was physical and visible, and it changed the very look of the world these people lived in. The parish church, which had stood at the heart of every community for centuries, was transformed before their eyes. The images of the saints, painted and carved, that had gazed down from every wall and pillar, familiar as family, were taken down, defaced, burned, or smashed. The wall paintings, the great dooms and the saints' lives that had covered the plaster in glowing colour, were whitewashed over, buried under a blank and silent coat of lime. The rood, the great carved figure on the cross that had hung above the entrance to the chancel, was pulled down. The shrines were dismantled, the relics scattered, the holy water stoups emptied and broken, the coloured glass in places replaced with plain. The reformers meant it as a purification, a cleansing of the house of God from idolatry and clutter, a return to a truer and simpler worship. But to many who had grown up in the old churches, warm and crowded with colour and image and the faces of the beloved saints, it must have felt like a bereavement, as though the walls had gone blind and the building had been emptied of its friends. Imagine an old man or woman, in the middle of that century, who had knelt as a child before the painted saint that was now a whitewashed blank, who had watched the candles burn before an image that was now a scar on the wall, who had been taught to pray to helpers who were now forbidden to be named. The whole sacred furniture of their inner life had been carried out and broken while they watched, and they were told that it had all been error, all these years, all this comfort, a long delusion now happily ended. Some embraced the new plainness with relief and even joy, glad to be rid of what they too had come to see as superstition. But many carried the old ways quietly in their hearts, kept a forbidden set of beads, muttered a banned prayer, remembered the saints in secret, and taught their children, in whispers, the things that could no longer be said aloud. And in that long, slow, half-hidden struggle between the new faith and the old, carried on in 10,000 ordinary hearts and homes, the whole vast question of what was true religion and what was mere superstition was fought out, not in the books of scholars, but in the daily life of a bewildered and divided people, trying to save their souls in a world whose rules had changed beneath their feet. This is the final and deepest strangeness of the Tudor supernatural world, that superstition was so often simply the name you gave to someone else's religion. The word was a weapon, hurled across the religious divide in both directions, the Protestant calling the Catholics' holy water a superstitious charm, the Catholic calling the Protestants' bare and stripped-down worship a cold impiety that had thrown away the true and blessed helps to salvation. And caught in the middle were the ordinary people who mostly went on doing much as they had always done, mixing the old and the new, saying a forbidden prayer, and scratching a protective mark, and consulting the cunning woman, and attending the Reformed Church, holding it all together in the vast, tolerant, frightened muddle of actual human belief, which has never in any age sorted itself neatly into the boxes that scholars and priests would like to put it in. And that muddle, that endlessly practical reaching for whatever might help, is perhaps the truest picture of the Tudor mind that we can carry away, more honest than any tidy account of doctrines and laws. And now, at the end of our long night, we can come back at last to the woman we began with, and see her whole, and understand what was really done to her. Anne Boleyn was not a witch. She commanded no dark powers, made no pact, cast no spell upon the king or anyone else. She was a clever, ambitious, frightened, and finally desperately unlucky woman who reached for the greatest prize in the land and grasped it and was destroyed by it, brought down by the ordinary and entirely human machinery of court politics, of a king's cooling desire and a rival's rising star and the deadly manoeuvres of powerful men. There was nothing supernatural about her fall. It was as worldly as a fall can be. But her enemies could not leave it there, and this is the thing to understand. In the decades after her death, when her daughter sat upon the throne as the great Protestant queen, those who hated everything the Boleyns and the Tudors had done needed Anne to be more than an unlucky woman. They needed her to be a monster, because a monstrous mother made a tainted daughter, and a tainted daughter had no true right to the crown. And so they reached into the deep well of their age's darkest imaginings, the well of witch fear, and the devil's mark, and the woman who bewitches a king. And they drew all of it up and poured it over her memory. They gave her the sixth finger that marks the servant of hell. They gave her the great wen upon the throat where a familiar might suckle. They gave her the whole dark costume of the witch, stitched onto her long after she could no longer speak in her own defence. And because that costume fitted so perfectly the fears of the age, it clung, and it has clung for centuries, until a clever and unlucky woman, who was judicially murdered on false charges of treason, is remembered by half the world as a six-fingered sorceress. There is a small, quiet piece of evidence that I find unbearably moving, and it makes the perfect place to close her story. In the reign of her daughter, when Sanders' slander was fresh and spreading, someone painting a portrait of Anne appears to have taken deliberate care to answer it. Studies of one such portrait have found that the artist changed the position of her fingers as the work went on, moving them into full and open view, and painting there, plainly and clearly upon each hand, 5 ordinary fingers. It is a tiny act, a silent rebuttal in paint, a refusal to let the lie stand. 5 fingers, an ordinary human hand, the hand of a woman, not a witch. And in that small, careful correction, someone across the centuries reached out to give Anne Boleyn back her humanity, the humanity that fear and hatred and the dark imagination of the age had tried so hard to strip from her. She was only ever a woman. That was the truth they kept trying to bury, and it is the truth we can give back to her now, at the end of the night. Because that, in the end, is what this whole thronging world of Tudor magic and dread was really made of. Not stupidity, not madness, fear, and the human need to give fear a shape. When we look back at the witch bottles under the hearth and the mark scratched above the door, at the comets watched with dread and the changelings mourned in the cradle, at the widow accused and the queen slandered, we are not looking at a people more foolish than ourselves. We are looking at people exactly as clever and exactly as frightened as we are, living in a world far bleaker and more dangerous and less understood than ours, and doing what human beings have always done and will always do, which is to look into the overwhelming dark of a threatening world and try with every story and charm and mark and ritual they can devise to make it bearable, to find the cause behind the suffering, to hold back the night for one more night. We do it still. We are simply better at hiding it from ourselves. We knock on wood and avoid the unlucky number, and feel a chill we cannot name in an empty house at 3 a.m, and reach, in our own frightened moments, for our own small rituals against an universe that remains under all our knowledge as vast and indifferent and frightening as it ever was. The Tudors were not another kind of creature. They were us, with the lights off and the dark pressing close, and no science yet to name what moved in it, and their charms and their fears and their terrible mistakes are simply the human heart, doing in the candlelight what it has always done. And there is something, I think, not frightening, but almost tender in that recognition. The sense of all those people across all those centuries lying awake in the dark as we sometimes lie awake, listening to the wind in the thatch, holding their small defences close, and longing, as we long, for the safety of the morning. So let the whole of it soften now, and grow dim, and drift away from you. The candle-lit chamber and the smoky cottage, the scratched mark and the buried bottle, the blazing comet and the quiet portrait with its 5 careful fingers, let them all fade gently into the dark, like figures walking away down a lane at dusk, until only the warmth remains, and the quiet, and the soft weight of your own tiredness carrying you down. You are safe. The night outside your window holds nothing but the night, and all those long-ago fears, and all those long-gone people, have finished their watch at last, and so, now, may you. If these hours we have spent together are something you would like to find again, you are always welcome to subscribe, and to come with me the next time we go wandering into the past. It has been a quiet pleasure to keep you company tonight, wherever you are, and however late it has grown. Let your thoughts slow down now. Let the last of the day go. Let the warmth of the covers and the hush of the house gather round you, and carry you gently down into sleep. Sleep well. Stay warm. Be kind to the people in your house. And I will see you in the next one. Good night.